Today we will be exploring the complete life of Marie Antoinette. Sit down or lay down, relax, because this is going to take a while. The clock on the mantelpiece in the Hofburg Palace reads 30 minutes past 8 in the evening. It is the 2nd of November, 1755. Outside the thick glass windows, the air temperature hovers near freezing. Wind pushes against the heavy stone walls of the Austrian palace. Inside, tall beeswax candles burn in brass wall sconces. The flames cast yellow light across polished oak floorboards. The smell of melting wax and wood smoke fills the long corridors. Heavy wool tapestries hang from the plaster walls, thick enough to block the cold air seeping through the gaps in the window frames. In a heated private chamber, Empress Maria Theresa sits in a wide, padded armchair upholstered in red velvet. Her knuckles are white as her hands grip the wooden armrests. She wears a loose linen shift damp with sweat. Her breathing is heavy and rapid. She has been in labor since the morning. Female servants walk quickly across the woven carpet, carrying copper basins filled with steaming water. Stacks of clean, white linen cloths rest on a wooden table beside the hearth fire. A physician in a dark wool coat and several midwives in practical cotton dresses stand near the chair. They watch the Empress. At a few minutes before 9 o'clock, the Empress pushes a final time. A child emerges. A midwife catches the infant in her bare hands. The midwife wipes the blood and clear fluid from the child's skin with a warm cloth and cuts the umbilical cord with a steel blade. The infant opens her mouth and cries, the sound echoing off the painted plaster ceiling. 1,400 miles to the southwest, the city of Lisbon sits in ruins. Exactly 24 hours earlier, the tectonic plates beneath the Atlantic Ocean shifted. The ground in Portugal shook violently. Stone cathedrals collapsed into piles of jagged rubble, crushing the people inside. A massive wave of ocean water washed over the harbor docks, carrying wood, mud, and bodies into the narrow streets. Fires burned through the timber frames of the surviving houses. Between 30,000 and 50,000 people are dead. The couriers carrying the written reports of this event ride horses over muddy dirt roads in Spain and France. Their leather boots are covered in wet earth. The paper's best batches are weeks away from Vienna. Inside the Hofburg Palace, the inhabitants hear the wind outside and the crackle of the pine logs burning in the fireplaces. The new infant in the palace is the 15th child born to the Empress. 14 other children have come before her in this same building over the last 18 years. 10 of those older children are girls. The midwives wrap the new 11th daughter in a thick layer of white sheep's wool. They hand the bundle to a wet nurse. The wet nurse wears a clean, starched cotton dress that smells of lavender soap. She carries the baby out of the birthing chamber and walks down a long, drafty corridor toward the nursery wing. The floors here are made of wide wooden planks. Small wooden beds with feather mattresses line the walls of the interconnected rooms. Governesses sit in high-backed wooden chairs, watching the sleeping older children. The air in the nursery smells of warm milk and damp wool. The sun rises on the 3rd of November. At 10 in the morning, a procession of courtiers walks through the palace corridors to the Augustine church attached to the Hofburg. The heavy wooden doors open. The stone floors of the church are cold beneath their leather shoes. Priests wear stiff silk robes embroidered with heavy gold thread. They stand beside a carved stone baptismal font, filled with cold water. The air inside the church smells strongly of burning frankincense. A priest dips his fingers into the cold water and presses them against the infant's forehead. He speaks the Latin words of the christening ceremony, his voice bouncing off the high stone vaults. He names the child Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna. Every princess born to the Habsburg family receives the first name Maria. The court record keepers write the long string of names with black ink on thick parchment, using the surplus names to distinguish this infant from her 10 older sisters. The family will call her Antoine. The christening concludes, and the infant Antoine returns to the nursery wing. She drinks warm milk from the wet nurse. She sleeps. Around her, the Habsburg court operates on strict daily schedules. In the administrative offices on the lower floors, clerks dip goose feather quills into black ink, the nibs scratching against heavy paper. They write letters to diplomats stationed in Madrid, Naples, and Paris. They list the available daughters of the Empress, noting their ages and physical health. The paper lists are folded, sealed with melted red wax, and packed into leather satchels. Messengers carry these satchels on horseback across the continent, riding over cobblestones and dirt tracks. The kings and princes of other nations read these lists in their own palaces. They seek wives for their sons to secure borders and trade agreements. The paper bearing Antoine's name travels out into a crowded market of royal daughters. Antoine lies on her back in a carved wooden crib. The white linen sheets fold over her chest. The sheets are large, sized for a growing child, and they pool around her small legs. She breathes in the scent of the washed linen. Outside the tall glass window of the nursery, the temperature drops further. Flakes of snow fall from the dark gray clouds. The white flakes land on the gravel paths of the Hofburg gardens. The snow accumulates on the bare branches of the oak trees and covers the shoulders of the marble statues. The infant breathes rhythmically in the quiet room. She will spend the next 10 years growing in these rooms, moving between the winter walls of the Hofburg and the summer gardens of the country palaces, surrounded by the strict daily routines of the imperial governesses and the ticking clocks of the nursery. The yellow plaster facade of Schönbrunn Palace reflects the morning sunlight. Outside the windows, gardeners pull metal rakes across crushed white gravel. Green boxwood hedges line the pathways in geometric squares. The air smells of damp soil and blooming roses. During the summer months, the Austrian court occupies these large country grounds. In the winter, the court returns to the Hofburg Palace in the city center, and the children ride in wooden carriages to the hunting lodge at Laxenburg. Iron runners of wooden sleds carve deep grooves into the packed white snow on the small hills. The cold wind blows against the faces of the children, turning their breath into white vapor in the freezing air. Dozens of children sleep in the interconnecting rooms of the imperial nursery. Governesses walk across the wooden floorboards before the sun rises, carrying heavy copper basins filled with cold water. The children wash their faces and arms with coarse linen cloths. Servants pull stiff cotton dresses over the girls' heads and tighten the laces at their backs. The daily rhythm operates on a precise schedule. Every morning, the children walk into the palace chapel. They kneel on hard wooden boards. The smell of burning frankincense fills the tight space. The children recite their confessions to the priests, their voices murmuring against the stone walls. Following the prayers, the sounds of education begin. Music masters tighten the metal strings of harpsichords. Dancing masters pull horsehair bows across the strings of violins, tapping a steady beat on the floorboards with the heels of their leather shoes. The Empress Maria Theresa begins her summer days at 4 o'clock in the morning and her winter days at 6 o'clock. She sits at a wide mahogany desk in her private chambers. A brass lamp illuminates stacks of thick paper. She dips a goose feather quill into an iron inkwell. She drags the wet nib across parchment, signing orders and drafting laws. Her ink marks the governance of an empire stretching across 250,000 square miles of land. Couriers take the papers, seal them with melted red wax, and carry them in leather satchels out of the palace. The empress manages the affairs of state, armies, and agriculture. She spends 15 minutes each week walking through the nursery, observing the posture and health of her youngest daughters before turning around and walking back to her heavy wooden desk. The court calls the 11th daughter Madame Antoine. She sits on a velvet cushioned stool in the music room. Her leather shoes tap continuously against the wooden floorboards, her legs swinging from the seat. She shifts her weight from side to side. She presses her small fingers against the ivory keys of the harpsichord, playing scales for the music master. Later in the day, she holds a wooden flute to her lips, blowing air through the carved mouthpiece. When the tutors place leather bound books in front of her, she drags her finger under the ink letters, halting her voice at long syllables and closing the covers after a few pages. During writing lessons, she grasps the quill tightly. The ink pools into dark blots on the parchment. Her written letters slant at sharp, irregular angles across the page. Her tutors press their palms against their foreheads, look at the stained paper, and sigh loudly. In the autumn of October 1762, sunlight streams through the tall glass windows of the Hall of Mirrors inside Schönbrunn Palace. Servants rub thick blocks of beeswax over the oak floorboards, polishing the wood until the surface reflects the light of hundreds of candles burning in the chandeliers. A 6-year-old boy named Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart visits the court to perform music. He wears a tailored velvet coat and a small powdered wig. He walks across the wide room toward the royal family. The smooth leather sole of his shoe catches the edge of the wax. He slips, falling hard onto his hands and knees on the solid oak floor. The 7-year-old Madame Antoine steps forward from the line of children. She reaches out, grabs the boy's hand, and pulls his arm upward until he stands flat on his feet again. 1763, men in heavy wool coats sit around wooden tables in Paris and Vienna, signing parchment and documents. The 7 Years' War concludes. Soldiers drop their muskets and return to their farms. The Austrian Empire and the French kingdom exchange ambassadors, seeking to maintain their new alliance. The chief minister of Austria, Kaunitz, lays large painted maps on the table in front of the empress. He points to the physical borders separating France and Austria. The empress dips her quill and signs a series of marriage contracts for her older children. Year by year, servants pack large wooden trunks with silk dresses, silver brushes, and leather shoes. The older sisters climb into padded carriages and travel over dirt roads to take their positions on the thrones of Naples and Parma. The wet nurses strip the linen sheets from the empty beds in the nursery. By 1767, the large pool of candidates shrinks to a single archduchess. Madame Antoine is 11 years old. The empress walks beside her youngest daughter on the crushed gravel path between the tall boxwood hedges. The empress speaks in the local Austrian dialect of German, her voice flat and instructional. She tells her daughter she will marry the heir to the French throne. She states that the peace of Europe relies on this physical exchange of bodies across the border. Madame Antoine listens to the German words. She wears heavy Austrian wool garments. She practices a wide, stomping Austrian dance step on the gravel. She speaks the French language with a thick, heavy accent, missing vocabulary words and breaking grammar rules. In Paris, the French king prepares to send a dancing master, a hairdresser, and a priest in a carriage across the border to restructure the way the Austrian child walks, speaks, and breathes before she enters the court of Versailles. The heavy leaded glass of the Hofburg Palace windows blocks the cold winter wind. Inside the heated chamber, Empress Maria Theresa holds a sheet of thick parchment. The air smells of burning beeswax from the brass candelabras resting on the desk. The black ink on the page forms the handwriting of the Austrian ambassadors stationed in Paris. The ink describes the physical requirements of the French royal court. The French king requests a bride for his grandson, the Dauphin Louis Auguste. The words on the parchment detail the current state of Madame Antoine. The ambassadors describe her Austrian accent. They note the flat, hard vowels she produces when speaking the French language. They describe the uneven spacing of her teeth when she opens her mouth to speak. They report the wide, stomping steps of her Austrian dances. The Empress places the paper on the desk. She dips her quill in ink and writes orders for new instructors. Weeks later, wooden carriages with iron rimmed wheels roll into the gravel courtyard of the palace. French men step out of the carriages. They carry leather bags and wooden boxes. They walk up the stone stairs to the nursery wing. Abbé de Vermont, a French priest, sits across from the young archduchess at a polished oak table. The room smells of the lavender soap, used to wash the floorboards. Vermont places a heavy, leather bound French book on the table. Antoine drags her finger under the printed words. She sounds out the first few syllables and then halts her voice. She breathes out heavily. Vermont rubs his chin with his fingers. He opens her exercise books. He observes the empty white pages. He turns to the next page, looking at the large, ink-stained letters slanting across the paper. He taps his finger on the desk. He begins speaking the French vocabulary, instructing her to repeat the sounds and mimic the exact shape of his mouth. In the music room, a French dancing master named Nouvert wears smooth leather shoes. He stands on the polished oak floor. A musician sits in the corner, dragging a horsehair bow across the strings of a wooden violin. The friction produces a steady, high-pitched melody. Nover places his hands on Antoine's shoulders and pushes them backward, forcing her spine into a straight, vertical line. He lifts her chin with his index finger. He steps forward, sliding the sole of his shoe quietly across the wood. He instructs her to mirror the sliding, precise movements of the French minuet. She mimics the steps, placing her feet at the exact angles he dictates. Sweat forms on her forehead as she repeats the sliding motions for hours. A French hairdresser opens a wooden box containing tortue shell combs, glass jars of white powder, and iron pins. He stands behind the seated archduchess. He gathers her hair in his hands. He pulls the strands upward, creating strict tension on her scalp. He stacks the hair high above her head, twisting it into tight rolls. He pushes the cold iron pins into the bundled hair to secure the shape. He shakes a large puff of white, scented powder over the structure. The dust settles on her forehead and the shoulders of her gown, smelling heavily of crushed flowers. Tailors walk into the rooms carrying rolls of heavy French silk in shades of pale blue and gold. They wrap stiff cloth measuring tapes around her waist and chest. They pull the tapes tight against her ribs. They bring corsets reinforced with strips of rigid whalebone. They wrap the corsets around her torso and pull the laces at her back. The stiff bones press into her skin, restricting the expansion of her lungs. She takes shallow, rapid breaths. They drape the heavy silk over the corsets, pinning the fabric into the wide, rigid shapes designed by the tailors from Versailles. A French dentist named Pierre Laveran arrives in Vienna. He carries a small leather roll containing steel wires and metal pliers. Antoine sits in a high backed wooden chair. Laveran steps close to her, smelling of cloves and metal. He places his cold steel wires against the white enamel of her crooked teeth. He grips the ends of the wires with his metal pliers. He twists the pliers, pulling the wires tight against the teeth. She feels the sharp physical pain travel through her jaw and up into her temples. She grips the wooden armrests of the chair. Her knuckles turn white. She breathes through her nose. The steel wires remain tightly bound inside her mouth for 3 months, slowly shifting the roots of her teeth through the bone of her jaw. The tutors, tailors, and dentists spend 18 months altering her physical form. Every day, hands pull her shoulders, fingers twist her hair, and metal reshapes her jaw. In the spring of 1769, a courier from Paris rides a horse into the courtyard. He carries a heavy parchment document sealed with blue wax bearing the crest of King Louis XV. The document contains the formal request for the marriage between the Dauphin Louis Auguste and Madame Antoine. Empress Maria Theresa sits at her mahogany desk. The 14-year-old Antoine stands beside her. The Empress dips a fresh goose feather quill into the black ink. The metal nib scratches against the rough surface of the parchment. She signs her name, sealing the marriage agreement. Antoine turns away from the desk. She walks toward the tall glass window. The temperature outside drops. Small, white flakes of snow fall from the gray sky. The snow lands on the crushed gravel paths of the Schönbrunn gardens. The white layer covers the bare branches of the oak trees and the shoulders of the stone statues. She rests her fingertips against the cold glass pane. She watches the snow accumulate, marking the final winter she will spend looking at these specific trees. Servants walk into her chambers. They lift heavy wooden trunks and place them on the floorboards. They fold Austrian wool dresses and linen sheets, placing them inside the boxes. Blacksmiths outside hammer iron shoes onto the hooves of hundreds of horses. Carpenters check the wooden wheels of 57 carriages. Drivers pull tight leather harnesses over the horses' backs. The entire procession of Finchesque prepares to carry the Archduchess westward, moving her toward a newly constructed wooden pavilion, sitting on an uninhabited island in the middle of the Rhine River. On the 19th of April in the year 1770, the air inside the Augustinian church in Vienna smells of old dust and burning beeswax. The Archduchess Maria Antonia stands on the cold stone floor. She wears a heavy gown stitched with silver thread. Her brother Ferdinand stands beside her. The priests chant Latin words. The sounds echo off the high vaulted ceilings. The groom, the Dauphin of France, is located hundreds of miles away in a different country. Ferdinand speaks the vows and places a metal ring on his sister's finger. The ceremony makes her the Dauphine of France. 2 days later, 57 wooden carriages sit in the crushed gravel courtyard of the Hofburg Palace. Hundreds of horses stamp their iron-shod hooves against the stones. The animals breathe heavily in the cool morning air, releasing white plumes of vapor from their nostrils. Drivers pull thick leather straps tight over the horses' backs. Servants lift heavy wooden trunks bound in iron and strap them to the backs of the carriages. Maria Antonia climbs the wooden steps into the main carriage. She sits on the padded velvet bench. The driver cracks a leather whip. The wooden wheels with iron rims roll forward, grinding against the gravel. The procession moves out of the palace gates. The journey takes 14 days. The wooden wheels roll over dirt roads and cobblestone streets through the region of Bavaria. Rain falls onto the painted wooden roofs of the carriages. Mud splatters against the glass windows. The horses pull the heavy weight across hills and through dense green forests. Inside the carriage, the constant rocking motion pushes the passengers against the upholstered walls. The smell of wet wool and horse sweat permeates the damp air. The carriages arrive at the banks of the Rhine River. The fast moving water carries brown silt and broken tree branches. The river forms the physical border between the Austrian Empire and the Kingdom of France. In the center of the flowing water sits a small island covered in sand and low bushes. Carpenters have spent the previous weeks driving wooden pilings into the muddy banks sects of this island. They have erected a large pavilion built of freshly cut pine boards. The building contains 5 distinct rooms arranged in a straight line. The 2 rooms on the eastern side face Austria. The 2 rooms on the western side face France. A single large drawing room sits exactly in the center. Servants carry heavy oak chairs, carved wooden tables, and woven wool tapestries from nearby castles. They place the furniture on the bare pine floorboards of the pavilion. They hang the tapestries over the newly constructed wooden walls. The pavilion smells of wet sawdust and old wool. On the 7th of May, Maria Antonia walks over a wooden plank bridge connecting the eastern riverbank to the island. She wears her heavy Austrian garments. She steps through the wooden door and enters the first room on the Austrian side. Her Austrian ladies in waiting follow her inside. The heavy wooden door closes. The room is quiet, save for the sound of the river water rushing past the wooden pilings beneath the floorboards. The ladies in waiting step forward. They pull the iron pins from her hair, letting the thick strands fall flat against her back. They untie the tight laces at the back of her bodice. They pull the heavy fabric over her shoulders. The Austrian dresses fall in piles on the pine floor. The women unlace her undergarments and slide the thick cotton and wool pieces down her legs. They roll the knitted stockings down her calves and pull them off her feet. She slips her feet out of her leather shoes. A small pug dog named Mops sits on the wooden floorboards. He pants, his tongue hanging out of his mouth. His small claws click against the wood. He sits next to the discarded pile of Austrian clothing. Maria Antonia stands entirely unclothed in the center of the small room. The cool air of the river island touches her bare skin. Water forms in the corners of her eyes. The liquid spills over her lower eyelids, runs down her cheeks, and drips from her chin onto her bare chest. She breathes in quickly, her shoulders rising and falling. Every item brought from Vienna rests on the floorboards around her feet. The inner door opens. Women from the French court step into the room. They carry layers of fine French silk and stiff white linen. They drape the clean linen shift over her arms and pull it down her torso. They hold a new corset lined with rigid strips of whalebone against her ribs. They pull the silk laces tight, compressing her waist. They place wide, circular hoops around her hips and tie the fabric straps. They lift a heavy gown of pale blue French silk and lower it over her head. The silk settles over the hoops, stretching out wide across the room. They slide delicate French leather slippers onto her bare feet. The ladies open the door to the central drawing room. The young woman walks forward in the stiff new clothes. The silk fabric rustles loudly as it drags across the pine boards. She crosses the central room and walks through the next doorway into the western rooms. The French courtiers wait for her there. They bow their heads. They speak to her. addressing her using the French pronunciation of her name. She is now Marie Antoinette. The Comtesse de Noailles stands among the French courtiers. She wears a highly structured dress. Her spine forms a perfectly straight vertical line. She watches the placement of Marie Antoinette's feet. She steps forward and uses her fingers to adjust the angle of the Dauphine's hands. She corrects the depth of her bow. Marie Antoinette listens to the continuous instructions regarding the precise angles of her limbs. Marie Antoinette walks out of the western door of the pavilion and crosses the second wooden bridge to the French side of the river. A new line of wooden carriages waits on the dirt road. She climbs into the lead carriage. The driver snaps the reins. The wheels turn. On the eastern bank of the river, the small pug dog runs in tight circles on the damp grass, panting heavily. The long line of carriages rolls westward into the French countryside. The dirt roads lead toward a massive stone palace located 12 miles southwest of the city of Paris, where a 15-year-old boy sits in a dusty attic workshop, sliding a metal file across a brass lock. The midday sun hits the pale limestone facade of the Palace of Versailles. 12 miles southwest of Paris, 5,000 people sit on tiered wooden benches. Carpenters built these temporary grandstands along the edges of the Hall of Mirrors, and beside the crushed white dirt paths of the sprawling gardens, the air smells of cut green grass, damp earth, and the heavy floral perfumes applied to the necks and wrists of the gathered crowds. Women in wide silk dresses hold painted paper fans in front of their faces to block the sunlight. Men in embroidered wool coats shift their weight on the hard wooden planks. On the uppermost floor of the palace, beneath the slanted gray slate of the roof, 15-year-old Louis Auguste stands inside a small, dusty room. Specks of dust float in the single beam of sunlight, entering through a small glass pane. He holds a thin steel file in his right hand. He drags the textured metal across the edge of a brass lock secured in an iron vise. The friction produces a high, scraping sound. Small curls of shaved brass fall onto the scarred wooden surface of the workbench. Louis Auguste wears thick glass spectacles resting on the bridge of his nose to correct his short-range vision. He places the steel file on the wood. He wipes the brass dust from his fingertips with a white cotton cloth. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy iron-rimmed wheels of Marie Antoinette's carriage grind to a halt on the paving stones outside the palace gates. Courtiers walk her through the long, echoing corridors to the Queen's state apartments. Women step forward and remove her travel clothes. They lower a new, highly structured gown over her head. The gown consists of stiff white cloth of silver. Hundreds of small, faceted diamonds and round white pearls are stitched tightly into the heavy fabric with silk thread. The women lace a stiff whalebone corset around her ribs, pulling the strings tight until she takes short, shallow breaths. They secure wide, circular hoops around her hips. The cloth of silver skirt drapes over the hoops, spanning several feet across the floorboards. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, she walks into the king's cabinet. The wooden floorboards creak under the combined weight of the gathered courtiers. Louis Auguste stands in the center of the room. He looks at her through the thick lenses of his spectacles. They stand near each other, surrounded by the quiet breathing of the observing crowd. Later in the day, Louis Auguste opens a leather-bound diary on a wooden desk. He dips a goose feather quill into black ink. He writes exactly 5 words on the rough paper. Meeting with Madame la Dauphine. He places the quill down and closes the heavy cover of the book. The couple walks side by side into the royal chapel. Sunlight passes through the tall, clear glass windows. reflecting off the gold leaf painted onto the high vaulted ceiling. The Archbishop of Rennes stands at the marble altar, wearing stiff silk robes trimmed in gold thread. He speaks the Latin marriage rites. The low sounds of his voice bounce off the tall stone columns. Marie Antoinette and Louis Auguste kneel side by side on padded velvet cushions. The Archbishop pours cold holy water from a silver vessel and speaks the final words of the ceremony. The heavy silver fabric of the bride's dress rustles loudly against the stone floor as she stands up. In the late evening, hundreds of courtiers crowd into the royal bedchamber. The room smells of burning beeswax from dozens of candles and the warm sweat of the dense crowd pressing together. The Archbishop stands at the foot of a massive wooden bed draped in heavy crimson damask curtains. He dips a sprig of green leaves into a bowl of holy water and flicks the cold drops onto the white linen sheets. Marie Antoinette and Louis Auguste climb into the high bed. They wear thin white linen nightshirts. The courtiers watch as servants pull the woven wool blankets over the teenagers' legs. The servants pull the heavy crimson damask curtains shut along their wooden rails, blocking the yellow light from the candles. The courtiers turn and walk out of the room. Their leather shoes step in rhythm on the wooden floorboards. The heavy wooden doors pull shut with a loud click of an iron latch. The two teenagers lie on their backs under the wool blankets. The dark space inside the curtains remains quiet. Louis Auguste keeps his hands flat against his sides. He turns his head away from his bride. He closes his eyes and goes to sleep. Marie Antoinette lies still on the mattress. The sun rises the next morning. The servants open the doors and pull back the heavy crimson curtain. Listens. The royal ambassadors from Austria and France step forward and look down at the mattress. The white linen sheets remain completely clean. The ambassadors turn around, walk to their respective desks, dip their quills in ink, and write letters to their monarchs describing the unaltered physical state of the bed. Marie Antoinette dictates her own account to a scribe, stating that her husband kept his hands entirely to himself throughout the night. The court holds large banquets and formal dances for 14 consecutive days. On the 30th of May, a large crowd gathers in the wide, crushed dirt square of the Place Louis XV in the center of Paris. The sun sets, leaving the square in darkness. Men touch lit torches to the string, fuses of paper, fireworks packed tight with black powder. The sparks travel up the string and ignite the powder. The rockets launch into the dark sky, exploding into bright white and red flashes of light. Loud bangs echo between the stone facades of the surrounding buildings. A burning spark falls from the sky and lands directly on a large stack of unlit fireworks stored on the dry ground. The black powder ignites all at once. The loud, concussive explosion sends thick black smoke and burning paper straight into the crowd. The people turn and run toward the narrow cobblestone streets, exiting the square. Thousands of bodies press hard against one another. Leather shoes catch on the uneven stones. People trip and fall to the ground. The crowd continues moving forward in the dark, stepping heavily on the fallen bodies. 132 people die from the crushing physical weight in the dirt square. 23 years later, workers will carry a tall wooden frame into this exact dirt square. They will attach a heavy, angled steel blade to a thick rope. They will name the open space the Place de la Révolution. Marie Antoinette sits at a small wooden desk in her private chambers at Versailles. She holds a goose feather quill. She dips the sharp tip into an iron inkwell. She drags the wet black ink across a piece of white parchment. writing a letter to her mother in Vienna. She uses the French vocabulary words she learned from the Abbé de Vermont. The dark ink forms large, uneven letters that slant sharply across the page. Hundreds of miles away, Empress Maria Theresa holds the letter in her hands. She sits in her heated chamber in the Hofburg Palace. She looks at the sloping ink marks. She reads the words describing the events of the wedding and the quiet but separate nights in the large bedchamber. The Empress places the paper flat on the mahogany desk, her eyes fixed on the blank white spaces between the lines of ink, preparing to send new, highly detailed instructions to correct the lingering physical distance between the bride and the groom. The court of King Louis XV moves through the wide corridors of the Palace of Versailles. The king is 60 years old. Deep wrinkles line the skin around his eyes and mouth. He wears coats of heavy blue velvet embroidered with gold threads. He walks beside his official mistress, Madame du Barry. She wears thick layers of white powder on her face and red rouge on her cheeks. Heavy diamond necklaces rest against the skin of her chest. The courtiers step aside as the older king and his mistress walk over the polished oak floorboards. 14-year-old Marie Antoinette lives inside this crowded building. At night, she climbs out into the large wooden bed beside her teenage husband, Louis Auguste. The servants pull the heavy curtains shut. The two bodies lie on opposite sides of the wide mattress. The white linen sheets remain clean. Louis Auguste suffers from a tight ring of tissue on his physical anatomy. The foreskin is too tight to retract. Any friction against the skin causes sharp, tearing pain in his nerve endings. He turns his back to his wife, pulls the woven wool blankets up to his chin, and sleeps. In the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, Empress Maria Theresa dips a goose feather quill into an iron inkwell. She writes letters to her daughter on thick parchment. She asks direct, clinical questions about the physical acts occurring inside the bedchamber at Versailles. Over the span of 7 years, she uses more than 60% of the ink and paper to demand detailed reports on fertility, bodily fluids, and anatomical contact. Couriers carry these papers in leather satchels across the continent. Marie Antoinette reads the ink on the pages, holding the parchment in her hands. She fills the long, empty hours at Versailles by sitting at round wooden tables covered in green wool baize. She holds stiff paper playing cards in her hands. Stacks of silver coins sit on the green fabric. She slides the silver pieces across the table, betting heavily on the turn of the painted cards. She sits in the straight-backed wooden chairs for 6 or 7 hours at a time. The tall beeswax candles burn down into soft pools of warm wax on the brass stands. Two young women, the Princess de Lamballe and the Duchess of Polignac, sit beside her. They wear heavy silk dresses and slide their own silver coins across the green wool. During the day, Marie Antoinette sits in front of a glass mirror. Her hairdresser, Leonard, gathers her hair in his hands. He pulls the strands straight up towards the ceiling. He inserts rigid wire frames into the hair to hold the vertical shape. He pins additional human hair into her own, building a structure that rises 36 inches above her scalp. He pushes small wooden model ships, fabric flowers, and glass beads into the bundled hair. He coats the entire tower in white, scented powder. Marie Antoinette holds her head perfectly still. Her neck muscles strain under the heavy physical weight of the wire, wood, and hair. The older princesses, the daughters of the king, watch the young Dauphine walk through the hallways. They hold painted paper fans in front of their faces. They speak in low, quiet voices. They point their fingers at the tall hairstyles and the gambling tables. The courtiers listen to the words. They repeat the sentences, blaming the foreign girl for the empty nursery. Habsburg court etiquette dictates the physical interactions of royals. Marie Antoinette walks past Madame du Barry in the wide corridors. She looks straight ahead, keeping her lips pressed together tightly. She walks past the mistress in complete silence for 2 years. King Louis XV frowns at this behavior. Empress Maria Theresa writes angry letters from Vienna, demanding a spoken interaction. On a designated afternoon, Marie Antoinette stops walking. She looks at Madame du Barry. She opens her mouth and speaks a single sentence. There are a lot of people at Versailles today. She continues walking down the corridor. On the 10th of May, 1774, King Louis XV lies flat on his mattress. Raised red pustules cover the skin of his face, arms, and chest. The smallpox virus ravages his cells. A foul smell of decaying tissue fills the bedchamber. The physicians stand back. The king's chest stops rising. The air empties from his lungs. Heavy leather shoes hit the wooden floorboards in the hallway. A large group of courtiers runs apartments of Louis Auguste and Marie Antoinette. The footsteps sound like a rumbling physical wave. They reach the young couple. Louis Auguste is now King Louis XVI, and the 18-year-old girl is the Queen of France. The two teenagers drop to their knees. Their kneecaps hit the hard oak floorboards with a loud thud. They press their palms together. They speak toward the ceiling. Dear God, guide and protect us. We are too young to reign. 3 years pass. In April 1777, a wooden carriage rolls into the Versailles courtyard. Emperor Joseph II, Marie Antoinette's older brother, steps out. He wears a plain brown wool coat. He walks into the private cabinet of King Louis XVI. The two men sit in wooden chairs. Joseph speaks in plain German words. He describes the exact anatomical mechanics required to consummate a marriage. He details the specific physical angles and the necessity of enduring brief pain. Louis XVI listens to the words and nods his head. Months later, the physical act takes place between the king and queen. In December 1778, Marie Antoinette lies on her bed in the Queen's state apartments. 8.5 years have passed since her wedding day. Her skin is covered in a heavy layer of sweat. She breathes rapidly, pushing down with her abdominal muscles. A baby emerges. It is a girl named Marie Thérèse Charlotte. The infant cries loudly. 1,000 courtiers pack into the bedchamber. They stand shoulder to shoulder, pressing their bodies together to watch the birth. They wear thick winter wool and heavy silk. The heat from their bodies raises the temperature of the room. The air smells intensely of stale sweat, leather, and heavy floral perfume. Marie Antoinette breathes the hot, thick air. Her head falls back against the wet linen pillows. She holds the small infant against her chest. The loud voices of the 1,000 courtiers reflect off the plaster walls, pressing in on her ears. She looks past the wall of human bodies toward the tall glass windows. Outside, cold wind blows over the crushed gravel paths of the gardens. 1 kilometer away from the crowded palace, a small neoclassical house stands among the green oak trees, holding empty rooms and locked wooden doors. 1 kilometer away from the massive main palace of Versailles, pale limestone blocks form the square walls of a smaller house. The building is the Petit Trianon. Tall, rectangular windows reflect the green leaves of the surrounding oak trees and the blue sky. The air here smells of damp soil, crushed white gravel, and growing boxwood. King Louis XVI stands on the dirt path. He places a heavy iron key into the palm of Marie Antoinette's hand. The metal is cold and thick. The key fits exactly into the brass locks of the wooden doors. She takes possession of the building and dictates the rules of physical entry. Visitors must present a paper invitation bearing her signature in black ink to pass the armed guards standing at the perimeter. The king himself halts his carriage at the outer iron gates. He sits on the padded leather seat of his carriage. He waits until a servant physically delivers a written paper pass from the queen before his horses step onto the grounds. Inside the house, the wall panels feature painted green vines and small white flowers. Light mahogany chairs hold pale blue silk cushions. The rooms smell of fresh roses cut from the garden and placed in water-filled porcelain vases. Laborers dig deep trenches into the dirt with heavy iron shovels. The metal blades scrape against buried rocks. They redirect the flow of water from nearby rivers to fill the trenches, creating artificial winding streams. The water runs over smooth river stones. Gardeners plant weeping willow trees along the muddy banks. They lay thick green turf over rolling dirt hills. They construct a small circular temple on an island in the middle of a newly dug pond. 12 white marble columns rise from the stone floor, supporting a carved dome. Marie Antoinette walks over the soft grass. She wears a dress made of plain, lightweight white muslin cotton. The stiff whalebone corsets and heavy silver fabrics remain locked inside wooden trunks in the main palace. The loose white cotton fabric brushes against the tops of the grass blades. The soft leather soles of her slippers press into the damp earth. Between the years 1783 and 1786, carpenters and masons build a working farm village around a large artificial lake. They call it the Hameau de la Reine. Men stack thick wooden beams and apply gray stone mortar. They cover the slanted roofs with thick bundles of dried yellow straw. A wooden water wheel turns slowly in the flowing stream, the wooden paddles splashing into the water. The turning wheel grinds hard wheat kernels into fine powder between two heavy circular millstones. A dairy building contains white porcelain bowls resting on polished marble tables. The air inside the dairy is cool and smells of fresh cream. Servants wash the wool of live sheep with soap and warm water. The wet wool smells of heavy floral perfume. Servants tie strips of pink and blue silk ribbon around the necks of the animals. The sheep chew on the green grass. Real peasant farmers live in the thatched cottages. They pull milk from the udders of the cows and plant root vegetables in the dark dirt plots. Marie Antoinette visits the hamlet. She holds a ceramic jug by its handle and walks across the dirt paths, mimicking the physical motions of a milkmaid. The builders and carpenters receive their wages in silver coins. The total volume of silver required to purchase the wooden beams, the imported stone, the marble tables, and the landscaping equals the exact price required to build a naval warship equipped with tall wooden masts, heavy canvas sails, and thick brass cannons. During the months the carpenters secure the thatched roofs of the hamlet, a standard French peasant family sits at a rough wooden table in a small mud brick house. They chew dark bread made of coarse flour. They place a small cut of animal meat into a cast iron boiling pot one time, every 4 weeks, usually on the morning of a religious feast day. Back in the long corridors of the main palace, the excluded aristocrats stand on the oak floorboards. Their hands hold only silk fans and lace handkerchiefs. They look through the glass windows toward the distant tops of the trees surrounding the Petit Trianon. They open their mouths and speak words detailing invented scenes occurring inside the locked gates. 12 miles away, in the dense city of Paris, printers pull the heavy wooden levers of mechanical presses. Iron plates push wet, black ink into cheap, thin paper. The smell of sulfur and oil ink fills the air around the printing presses. The printed pamphlets stack up in the tight, poorly ventilated rooms. The ink forms words describing the Queen. The sentences detail physical acts in beds, with female courtiers and male soldiers. Other pages contain text describing the king's anatomical failures, and claiming the royal children are the biological offspring of other men. Booksellers stack these printed sheets on wooden tables in the stone arcades of the Palais Royal. Men and women hand over copper coins. They hold the ink stained paper in their hands, leaving grease from their fingers on the margins as they read the words. Decades after these events, writers print books containing the phrase, "Let them eat cake," and place the Queen's name next to the words in black type. The physical origin of that specific sentence exists in a bound book titled Confessions, written by a man named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau dips his quill into an inkwell and writes those exact words on a paper page between the years 1765 and 1769. On the exact days Rousseau presses his quill to the paper in France, Marie Antoinette is 11 years old. She wears Austrian wool dresses. She walks on the crushed gravel paths of Vienna, hundreds of miles away from the French border. Rousseau's ink on the paper attributes the quote to an unnamed great princess. The revolutionary pamphlet printers in Paris during the late 18th century print entirely different accusations on their pages. The specific words concerning cake remain trapped inside Rousseau's bound book. The sun drops below the tree line at the edge of the Versailles estate. The sky turns dark gray. Marie Antoinette walks on the dirt path leading away from the thatched roofs of the hamlet, moving back toward the pale limestone walls of the main palace. Servants walk 20 paces ahead of her on the path. They hold glass lanterns containing lit oil wicks. The yellow flames cast moving shadows across the crushed gravel and the trunks of the oak trees. The wind blows from the east, rustling the green leaves. The moving air carries the faint, distant sound of wooden cart wheels rolling over cobblestones and the shouts of market vendors 12 miles away. The wind travels over the city of Paris. Inside the government buildings of that city, men sit at wooden desks and open heavy leather ledgers. The columns of black ink on the ledger siege show the government debt, requiring half of all the silver and gold coins collected through taxation just to pay the interest. The ink records a mathematical reality resulting from the massive physical cost of supplying wooden ships, iron muskets, and thousands of soldiers across the Atlantic Ocean to fight a war in America. Men sit at long wooden desks inside the government buildings of Paris. They open heavy, leather bound ledgers. The spines crack as the thick paper pages turn. The men dip goose feather quills into iron inkwells. They drag the wet black ink across the paper, writing columns of numbers. The numbers represent physical quantities of gold and silver coins. The ink totals reach roughly 1.3 billion livres. Laborers carry wooden crates filled with the silver onto the wooden decks of sailing ships. The ships cross the Atlantic Ocean. The silver pays for iron muskets, black gunpowder, and heavy canvas sails used by soldiers fighting the British Army in America. The clerks in Paris write new columns of numbers showing the interest payments on the kingdom's borrowed money. These specific numbers require half of all the copper, silver, and gold coins collected by tax officials across the country during a single year. Men wearing embroidered silk coats serve as finance ministers. They walk into the king's cabinet at the Palace of Versailles. They place stacked paper documents on the king's mahogany desk. The black ink on these papers proposes collecting silver coins from the men who own large stone chateaus and the bishops who preach in the cathedrals. King Louis XVI looks at the papers. He dips his own quill and signs different documents. The finance ministers pack their clothing into wooden trunks and ride away from the palace in carriages. New ministers arrive, write similar proposals on new sheets of paper, pack their own trunks, and leave. Inside the Queen's apartments, a dressmaker named Rose Bertin walks across the parquet floorboards. She carries heavy rolls of striped silk, dark velvet, and gold lace. She cuts the fabric with steel scissors. She pushes metal pins through the silk. Over the course of 12 months, she delivers roughly 300 new gowns to the Queen. The court jeweler, Boehmer, places flat wooden boxes on the tables. The boxes are lined with soft black velvet. They hold diamond earrings and pearl bracelets. Marie Antoinette takes the jewelry. She signs paper promissory notes, transferring amounts of silver to the jeweler in scheduled installments. The hairdresser, Léonard, stands behind the Queen. He pulls her hair straight upward. He inserts stiff wire frames against her scalp. The hair rises 36 inches into the air. The top of the powdered hair structure reaches higher than a standing 2-year-old child. Leonard pins small wooden models of naval ships with tiny canvas sails into the powdered bundles. He attaches small glass vials holding water and living green vines. He builds miniature scenes of recent military battles using painted tin soldiers and dyed green wool. The entire structure smells strongly of crushed floral powder and animal fat pomade. The Queen holds her neck perfectly straight to support the physical weight of the wire, wood, and glass. In the center of Paris, the stone arcades of the Palais Royal provide shelter from the rain. The air under the arches smells of roasting meat, spilled wine, and sulphurous printing ink. Men stack cheap paper pamphlets on wooden folding tables. Customers hand over copper coins and pick up the papers. The black ink on the pages prints a new name for the Queen. The letters spell Madame Deficit. The customers look at the ink-stained paper. Booksellers empty their tables and carry in new stacks of freshly printed sheets. The columns of numbers written in the official royal ledgers show the Queen's dressmakers, jewelers, and hairdressers consume between 5 and 7% of the household budget. The buyers of the pamphlets look at the tall hair and listen to the Austrian accent of the Queen. They speak words to each other on the cobblestones. They describe scenes of the Queen packing heavy leather suitcases full of gold coins. They describe men loading these heavy suitcases into carriages, driving east toward the border of Vienna. The physical carriages traveling east carry only folded linen dresses and paper letters sealed with wax, but the spoken words pass from mouth to mouth across the markets and streets. On the 22nd of October, 1781, Marie Antoinette lies on the mattress in her bedchamber at Versailles. The air in the room is hot. Sweat covers her forehead. She pushes her muscles downward. A male child emerges onto the white linen sheets. The child is Louis Joseph, the Dauphin of France. In Paris, soldiers stand beside heavy bronze cannons at the Invalides. They push cloth bags of black powder down the iron barrels. They touch burning ropes to the touch holes. The powder ignites. The cannons fire into the air. The loud concussions rattle the glass windows in the surrounding brick buildings. 4 years later, on the 27th of March, 1785, the Queen pushes a second son, Louis Charles, onto the sheets. On the 9th of July, 1786, she delivers a daughter named Sophie. 11 months pass. The infant Sophie stops breathing. The air leaves her small lungs. Servants place the small body in a wooden coffin, nail the lid shut, and bury the box in the dirt. Marie Antoinette wears a plain white muslin shift. She walks into her private chapel at Versailles. The air smells of cold stone and extinguished candle wicks. She kneels on a velvet cushion in front of the marble altar. The hard floor presses upward against her knees. She holds a folded piece of paper in her hands. The black ink on the paper forms words addressed to her mother in Austria. The letters ask what physical actions she has taken to receive the exact events happening around her. As her knees press into the velvet cushion, 12 miles away in a Paris workshop, two men stand over a heavy wooden table. The men are the court jewelers, Boehmer and Bassenge. They look down at a piece of jewelry resting on a black velvet cloth. The object is the exact circumference of a ceramic dinner plate. It contains nearly 650 individual diamonds set into silver metal linkages. The total weight of the stones pulls down heavily on the soft fabric. In the summer of 1784, hot air circulates through the open windows of a Paris workshop. Two men, the court jewelers Boehmer and Bassenge, stand over a heavy wooden table. A flat wooden box rests on the scarred surface of the wood. The box contains an interior lining of soft black velvet. A massive piece of jewelry sits on the dark fabric. The object matches the exact circumference of a ceramic dinner plate. 650 clear diamonds connect through thin links of silver wire. The combined mass of the stones equals nearly 2,800 carats. The total weight presses down heavily, compressing the pile of the velvet cloth. The jewelers originally constructed this piece years earlier for Madame du Barry. The jewelers carry the wooden box into the Palace of Versailles. They open the lid in front of Marie Antoinette. The sunlight from the windows enters the clear facets of the diamonds and refracts into sharp points of white light. Marie Antoinette looks at the stones. She turns her head to the side. She speaks words stating the kingdom requires its silver coins to purchase thick oak timbers and heavy canvas sails for naval warships. The jewelers close the wooden lid. The metal latch clicks. They carry the box back out of the room. A woman named Jeanne de la Motte walks through the wide corridors of Versailles. She has a short physical stature. She wears plain linen dresses. She possesses distant biological ties to the royal bloodline. She speaks words to courtiers, describing long conversations and a close physical friendship with the queen. She targets a wealthy churchman named Cardinal de Rohan. Rohan wears wide red silk robes and large gold crosses. He currently resides outside the queen's favor due to previous spoken words regarding her mother. He desires a return to the inner rooms of the court. Jean speaks to Rohan. She tells him she holds the ability to deliver his written apologies directly into the queen's hands. Jean sits at a small wooden desk. She holds a goose feather quill. She dips the sharp tip into an iron inkwell. She drags the wet black ink across thick sheets of white paper. She forms letters matching the handwriting of the queen. At the bottom of the paper, she signs the words Marie Antoinette de France. Royal protocol dictates the use of only a first name for signatures. Cardinal de Rohan holds the thick paper in his hands. His eyes scan the black ink. He accepts the signature. He believes the letters come directly from the Queen. On the night of the 11th of August, 1784, the sun drops below the horizon. The air cools in the gardens of Versailles. Shadows obscure the shapes of the oak trees and the carved marble statues. The smell of earth and crushed leaves rises from the soil. Cardinal de Rohan stands on a dirt path in the dark grove of Venus. He wears a heavy wool cloak over his red silk garments. He waits in the cold air. A woman walks onto the dirt path. She wears a white muslin dress. The pale fabric reflects the faint moonlight. Her name is Nicole. Jean pays her copper coins to stand in this specific location on this exact night. Nicole walks toward the cardinal. She holds a single red rose in her hand. She extends her arm. Rohan reaches forward. The sharp thorns of the rose stem press against the thick leather of his gloves. Nicole opens her lips and whispers a single sentence into the cold air. Rohan bows his head, lowering his chin toward his chest. He watches the white muslin dress turn and disappear into the shadows of the trees. The calendar moves to the 29th of January, 1785. Rohan sits at a desk. He grips a quill and signs a paper contract. The ink commits him to pay 6 million livres to the jewelers in 4 scheduled installments. The jewelers hand him the heavy black velvet box containing the diamonds. Rohan carries the box to an intersecting hallway. A man wearing a dark wool coat stands in the corridor. The man is Jean's husband. Rohan places the velvet box into the man's hands. The man turns and walks away, his leather shoes tapping against the oak floorboards. The heavy velvet box travels across the English Channel. In London, men sit in rooms smelling of burning coal. They hold sharp steel chisels and heavy iron hammers. They press the steel edges against the silver settings of the necklace. They strike the chisels with the hammers. The silver bends. The clear diamonds fall onto the wooden tables. Men place the loose diamonds into small leather pouches. They pull the drawstrings tight. They exchange the pouches for metal coins. The silver settings melt into liquid metal inside hot clay crucibles. On the 15th of August, 1785, the summer sun heats the stone walls of the Palace of Versailles. Inside the royal chapel, the air smells of burning frankincense and hot wax. Cardinal de Rohan wears his heaviest ceremonial robes. Thick gold lace covers the stiff red silk. He prepares to officiate the Mass. Royal guards march down the center aisle of the chapel. They wear blue wool coats and carry iron muskets with sharp steel bayonets attached to the barrels. Their heavy boots strike the marble floor in a unified rhythm. They stop in front of the cardinal. They point their hands toward the large wooden doors. Rohan walks out of the chapel. He steps into a waiting carriage. The wooden wheels roll over the cobblestones, carrying him toward the thick circular stone towers of the Bastille prison in Paris. In May of 1786, men in black robes sit on wooden benches inside a courtroom. They speak aloud, acquitting Cardinal de Rohan of all charges. The guards open the heavy iron doors. Rohan steps out onto the paving stones of the street. Inside the prison walls, guards hold Jean de la Motte against a wooden post. A man pulls a long iron rod from a burning coal fire. The tip of the iron glows bright orange. He presses the hot metal against the bare skin of her shoulder. The heat sears the flesh. White smoke rises toward the ceiling. The smell of burning hair and cooked meat fills the stone room. She sits in a dark cell. Months later, she travels over the water to London. She dictates words to printers. The printers press black ink onto paper pages, forming sentences that place the blame directly on the Queen. In Paris, men and women hold these printed pages in their hands. They trace the black letters with their fingers. They stand on the cobblestones and speak the words aloud to each other. They look at the high walls of the palaces. They read the ink describing diamonds, nighttime meetings, and stolen silver. 4 years pass. The calendar pages turn to the 4th of June, 1789. 7 miles from the main palace of Versailles sits the Chateau de Meudon. The air inside a specific deep chamber smells of damp linen and medicinal herbs. 7-year-old Louis Joseph, the Dauphin of France, lies on his back. A thick mattress of goose feathers presses against his spine. His spinal column bends at a sharp, irregular angle. The bones push against the thin layer of skin on his back. His ribs protrude from his chest. His breaths are shallow and rapid. Marie Antoinette sits in a wooden chair beside the bed. She holds a wet cotton cloth. She presses the damp cloth against the hot skin of her son's forehead. Outside the tall glass windows, carriages roll along the dirt roads, carrying men in dark coats toward the meeting halls of the Estates General. On the morning of the 4th of June, 1789, the air inside a bedchamber at the Chateau de Meudon smells of burning camphor and boiled linen. 7-year-old Louis Joseph lies flat on a mattress stuffed with goose feathers. His skeletal structure presses outward against his pale skin. A bacterial infection consumes the bone tissue of his spine. The vertebrae curve at a sharp, irregular angle. His ribs form visible horizontal ridges across his torso. A thick canvas corset lined with strips of steel rests on a wooden chair near the bed. Marie Antoinette sits on the edge of the mattress. She wears a plain dark dress. She holds a damp cotton cloth in her right hand. She presses the wet fabric against the hot, dry skin of her son's forehead. The boy breathes in short, rapid gasps. His small chest rises and falls quickly. At an exact moment in the morning hours, the air leaves his lungs. His chest lowers toward the mattress. The structure remains flat. The muscles in his face relax. He is 7 years and 7 months old. A man wearing a blue wool coat climbs onto a horse in the courtyard. He rides down the dirt road toward the main palace of Versailles. He carries a folded paper letter sealed with black wax. He walks into a massive assembly hall. Hundreds of men stand inside this hall. The men representing the Third Estate wear plain black wool coats and white linen cravats. The messenger breaks the black wax. He reads the ink words aloud. The sound of his voice bounces off the high plaster walls. He states the Dauphin is dead, and the king will remain inside his private apartments to observe mourning rites. A man in a black coat steps forward from the crowd. He speaks loudly, projecting his voice across the room. He describes his own children resting inside wooden boxes, buried in the wet earth of the French countryside. He states the men in the hall will maintain their positions on the stone floor. He states they will continue reading their documents and speaking their words. On the 17th of June, the men in the black coats raise their right hands into the air. They sign their names with black ink on a large sheet of thick parchment. The ink forms words declaring the gathered men to be the National Assembly. 3 days later, on the 20th of June, these same men walk to the tall wooden doors of their meeting hall. Heavy iron padlocks hang from the metal latches, securing the doors tight against the frames. Cold rain falls from the gray sky, soaking into the shoulders of their wool coats. The men turn and walk across the wet cobblestones. They march toward an indoor tennis court located nearby. The large, rectangular room smells of damp wool, sweat, and dry chalk dust. The men stand close together on the flat stone floor. They raise their hands toward the wooden rafters. They speak an oath aloud. Their voices blend together into a continuous, low roar. They state they will remain standing in this room until they write a new set of laws with ink on paper. The calendar moves to the 14th of July. The summer sun heats the paving stones of eastern Paris. A massive crowd of men and women stands outside the Bastille. High stone walls block the wind and cast dark shadows over the street. The people grip heavy iron pikes, wooden pitchforks, and stolen steel muskets in their hands. They strike the thick iron chains holding the wooden drawbridge. The metal links break. The heavy wooden planks fall forward and smash against the stone edge of the dry moat. A loud crack echoes off the prison walls. The crowd walks over the wood. The air fills with the smell of burning black powder and sulfur. The people surround the prison governor. A man lifts a long steel knife. He brings the heavy blade down against the back of the governor's neck. The sharp steel cuts through the skin, muscle tissue, and cervical bone. The man picks up the severed head. He pushes the sharp metal point of an iron pike up through the base of the neck. Thick red blood drips down the wooden pole, staining the skin of his hands. The crowd walks back through the narrow cobblestone streets, holding the wooden pole straight up into the air. Night falls over the Palace of Versailles. The Duke of Liancourt walks rapidly down the long, quiet corridors. His hard leather shoes strike the oak floorboards in a fast, even rhythm. He reaches the heavy wooden doors of the king's bedchamber. He knocks his knuckles against the thick wood. The king sits up on his mattress in the dark room. The duke speaks words detailing the fallen drawbridge, the burning gunpowder, and the severed head resting on the iron pike. The king listens to the physical descriptions. He opens his mouth and speaks. Is it a revolt? The duke looks at the king. He answers with a single sentence. No, sire, it is a revolution. Marie Antoinette sits in a wooden chair next to the small flat mattress at Moudon. She wears a black wool dress. She looks through the tall glass panes of the window. 30 miles away, bright orange flames consume the heavy wooden timbers of the customs houses in terrace. Thick columns of black smoke rise high into the night sky. The wind blows from the east, carrying the smell of burning pine and ash over the city. The smoke drifts down into the narrow streets, passing over the heads of thousands of women standing in long lines outside the locked doors of bakeries, holding copper coins in their hands, waiting for the sun to rise. Rain falls on the dark cobblestones of central Paris before dawn on the 5th of October 1789. Around the Halles market, women stand in long lines outside the wooden doors of bakeries. The air temperature is low. The women pull coarse wool shawls tight across their shoulders. The wooden shelves inside the bakeries sit completely bare. When the bakers pull flat loaves of dark brown bread from the hot brick ovens, the women hand over their metal coins. A single loaf of bread requires 8 or 9 copper coins. A laborer working all day, lifting heavy stones in the city, earns roughly 10 copper coins. The women hold the small discs of metal in their cold hands. They speak words to one another in the damp air. Their voices carry over the sound of the falling rain. They repeat pit accounts of a large banquet held 4 days earlier inside the Palace of Versailles. They describe soldiers wearing white wool uniforms, standing on the polished oak floorboards. They describe soldiers unpinning the new red, white, and blue cloth cockades from their coats, dropping the fabric onto the floor, and pressing the thick leather soles of their boots into the colored cloth. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the sky remains gray. Several thousand women walk away from the market. They move toward the stone facade of the Hôtel de Ville. They hold iron kitchen knives with carved wooden handles. They grip long wooden pikes topped with forged steel points. They walk into the city armory and wrap thick hemp ropes around the wooden carriages of heavy bronze cannons. They lean forward, pulling the ropes tight over their shoulders, and drag the cannons over the rough paving stones. The crowd turns southwest. They walk on the dirt road leading toward Versailles. The distance spans 12 miles. The rain mixes with the loose dirt, creating thick brown mud. The mud coats the thin leather of their shoes and the bottom edges of their wool skirts. By the late afternoon, the number of people walking on the road reaches 7,000. At the edge of the Versailles estate, Marie Antoinette walks on the soft green grass near the Petit Trianon. She wears a light muslin dress. The wind blows the thin fabric against her legs. A man riding a horse approaches her on the crushed gravel path. The horse breathes heavily, sweat foaming on its neck. The man speaks words describing the thousands of people marching on the Paris road. She turns and walks quickly back toward the tall limestone walls of the main palace. Deep in the nearby woods, King Louis XVI sits on a leather saddle. He holds a heavy iron hunting musket. Another messenger arrives on horseback. The king turns his horse and rides back through the trees. The sun sets, the sky turns black. The large crowd arrives at the tall iron gates of the palace. The wet wool of their clothing smells of damp, sheep, smoke, and human sweat. A group of women walks through the corridors and stands in front of the king. Water drips from their skirts onto the dry oak floorboards. The king sits at his mahogany desk. He dips a goose feather quill into an iron inkwell. He signs a paper document ordering the immediate transfer of white flour from the royal storehouses into the wooden carts of the women. Outside the iron gates, the people remain on the wet grass. They pull dry branches from the oak trees and ignite them with flint and steel. Yellow flames rise into the dark air. The heat warms their wet skin. Through the night, more people walk down the Paris road and join the camps. The number of people standing on the grounds increases to 60,000. At exactly 30 minutes past 5 in the morning on the 6th of October, a group of men and women push through an unguarded iron gate. They walk rapidly across the stone courtyard. They enter the palace. A royal guard stands near a wooden door holding an iron musket. He pulls the metal trigger. Black powder ignites with a loud crack. A lead ball strikes the plaster wall. Men in the crowd swing heavy iron pikes and sharp steel blades. The metal cuts through the guard's blue wool coat and pierces his skin. He falls onto the floorboards. A second guard runs forward. The iron blades strike his torso. The crowd moves up the wide marble staircases toward the Queen's apartments. Marie Antoinette climbs out of her high wooden bed. She wears a thin white cotton shift. She leaves her leather slippers on the floor. Her bare feet press directly against the cold wood. She runs down a narrow, dark corridor, connecting her rooms to the king's apartments. Her breath moves rapidly in her chest, pushing the white cotton fabric outward. Behind her, the heavy wooden doors of her bedchamber splinter and break apart. Men and women walk into the room. They lift their iron pikes. They thrust the sharp steel points down into the center of the feather mattress. The steel tears long holes in the white linen sheets. Thousands of white goose feathers float up into the air, settling on the wood floor. The Marquis de Lafayette walks into the king's rooms. He wears the blue and white uniform of the National Guard. He issues verbal orders to his soldiers. The soldiers lower the barrels of their muskets. The crowd stands outside on the crushed gravel. They look up at a wide marble balcony. They shout loud words, demanding the king travel to Paris. They shout words demanding the queen walk out onto the stone ledge. Marie Antoinette steps through the tall glass doors. She stands on the cold marble balcony alone. The wind blows the fabric of her dress. Below her, hundreds of men raise their heavy muskets, the distinct clicking sound of iron hammers, pulling back echoes in the air. The men point the circular steel barrels directly at the center of her chest. She bends her knees. She lowers her head toward the marble floor, performing a slow, deep bow. Lafayette walks through the glass doors. He steps beside her. He bends his right knee until the fabric of his trousers touches the stone. He takes her right hand in his fingers. He presses his lips against the skin of her hand. The men in the courtyard lower their muskets. The people open their mouths and shout loud cheers into the cold morning air. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the royal family climbs into a large, heavy carriage. The driver snaps the leather reins. The wooden wheels roll forward over the dirt road. Directly in front of the horses, men hold two long wooden pikes pointing straight up into the gray sky. The severed heads of the two royal guards rest on the sharp steel points. Dark red blood drips down the sides of the wooden poles. Marie Antoinette sits on the padded velvet bench inside the carriage. She looks through the thick glass window. She watches the pale limestone walls and the geometric green hedges of Versailles recede into the distance. The heavy carriage continues moving east over the uneven road, carrying the family into the dense center of Paris, toward a dusty, half furnished palace surrounded completely by the crowded stone streets and the loud voices of the city. The heavy iron rimmed wheels of the royal carriages roll onto the rough paving stones of central Paris. The Tuileries Palace sits directly in the middle of the dense city. The exterior features tall walls of gray limestone. Inside the building, a thick layer of pale dust coats the oak floorboards. Spiders weave dense webs in the dark corners of the high plaster ceilings. The air smells of dry rot, stale dampness, and settled dirt. Servants walk through the long corridors, carrying brooms constructed of stiff birch twigs. They sweep the dirt across the wood. Other laborers carry heavy mahogany chairs, wool tapestries, and carved oak tables from nearby storehouses. They place the heavy furniture on the bare floors. Through the thin glass of the tall windows, the continuous sound of thousands of human voices penetrates the rooms. The tightly packed stone buildings of Paris completely surround the palace. Courtyard. The smell of burning coal and raw sewage drifts from the city streets into the royal apartments. The royal family opens their trunks. King Louis XVI sits in a hard wooden chair. He holds thick, leather bound books in his hands. He turns the rough paper pages, reading printed black text detailing the reigns of previous English monarchs. Marie Antoinette sits at a small wooden writing desk. She holds a sharp steel knife. She slices a yellow lemon in half. Clear, acidic juice drips from the yellow rind into a small glass bowl. She dips the sharp tip of a goose feather quill into the citrus liquid. She drags the wet quill across thick sheets of white paper. The clear liquid dries on the surface. The paper appears completely blank. She dips a second quill into an iron inkwell. She writes standard sentences using dark black ink over the dried lemon juice. She folds the paper, drips hot red wax onto the folds, and presses a metal seal into the wax. Later, men in the distant cities of Vienna and Madrid hold these exact papers over the hot yellow flames of burning beeswax candles. The intense heat turns the dried lemon juice dark brown. The brown marks form hidden words detailing the physical locations of French soldiers and requesting the arrival of armed cavalry units. Count Axel von Fersen wears a tailored blue wool military coat. The Swedish officer walks through the stone corridors of the Tuileries. He sits in the wooden chairs near the Queen. He holds sheets of paper containing her handwriting. He reads the words. He dips his own quill into a glass inkwell. He writes thick, heavy blocks of dark ink directly over specific sentences in the letters, obscuring the original text beneath thick layers of black pigment. Centuries later, scientists push highly focused X ray beams through these thick ink layers. The radiation reveals the underlying physical words detailing deep, intense affection. Men wearing the blue and white wool uniforms of the National Guard stand at the edges of every doorway inside the palace. They grip long iron muskets. The sharp steel bayonets reflect the yellow light of the candles. When the royal family sits at the long dining table, they lift silver forks and chew pieces of roasted meat. The guards stand against the plaster walls, watching the chewing and swallowing. Outside the tall iron gates of this palace courtyard, large crowds of people stand on the cobblestones. They press their bare hands against the cold iron bars. The physical perimeter of the family's movement shrinks to the interior stone walls. In April of 1791, the air warms. Servants pack wooden trunks with linen clothing. They strap the heavy trunks to the backs of carriages. The royal family climbs onto the padded velvet seats. They intend to travel a short distance to the palace of St. Cloud. The driver snaps his leather reins. The horses step forward, their iron shoes striking the stones. Instantly, a massive crowd of men and women surge forward from the narrow street. They surround the wooden carriage. They press their physical bodies against the painted wooden doors and the iron rimmed wheels. They grip the leather harnesses of the horses. They plant their heavy leather boots on the cobblestones and physically block the forward motion of the animals. The Marquis de Lafayette sits on a brown horse nearby. He issues loud verbal commands to the crowd. The crowd remains standing in place. Marie Antoinette looks through the glass window at Lafayette. She speaks words stating their status as physical captives of the city. The family climbs out of the carriage. Their shoes step back onto the stones near the rooms. They walk back into the dusty rooms of the Tuileries. Person sits at a wooden table in a different building in Paris. He looks at a large paper map spread flat on the wood. He places his ink-stained fingers on a thin line indicating a dirt road traveling east toward the stone fortress of Montmédy. Armed royalist cavalry units wait near that specific fortress. Fersen hands copper and silver coins to carriage builders. The builders assemble a massive Berline coach. They hammer iron nails into thick oak planks. They attach wide wooden wheels, heavy iron leaf springs, and thick leather suspension straps. Fersen procures paper passports bearing official red wax seals. The black ink on the passports identifies the travelers as a Russian noblewoman named Baroness de Korff and her traveling staff. Marie Antoinette sits in front of a mirror in the Tuileries. She is 35 years old. The smooth glass reflects the skin of her face and the hair on her scalp. The dark chestnut pigment of her hair has faded completely. White and pale gray strands grow from the follicles. She holds a smooth bone comb. She pulls the teeth of the comb through the white hair. On the evening of the 20th of June, Marie Antoinette sits in her bedchamber. She holds a small leather case. She folds the forged paper passports. She slides the thick paper under the silk lining of the leather case. In the center of the room, her 6-year-old son, Louis Charles, holds a small toy musket carved from lightweight pine. He points the wooden barrel toward the plaster wall. Beside him, her teenage daughter, Marie Therese, sits in a chair. She holds a book and reads the printed words aloud. The sound of her voice fills the quiet room. Outside the heavy oak doors, the guards change their shifts, their heavy leather boots striking the stone floors. The folded papers rest hidden in the dark lining of the case. waiting for the dark hours of the coming midnight when the family will walk down the back staircases to the waiting Berline coach. At 30 minutes past 8 in the evening on the 20th of June, 1791, the air inside the Tuileries Palace smells of warm broth and melting beeswax. Servants place a ceramic bowl on a wooden table. 6-year-old Louis Charles swallows the liquid. The women pull his arms through the sleeves of a white cotton nightshirt and lay him flat on a feather mattress. By 11 o'clock, King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette lie down on their own beds. The heavy oak doors remain shut. Men in blue wool uniforms stand on the wooden floorboards outside the rooms. The guards listen to the quiet sounds of breathing from the other side of the wood. The clocks in the city strike midnight. Servants walk us across the floorboards, placing their leather shoes carefully on the wood to avoid making a sound. They lean over the bed and place their hands on the shoulders of the sleeping children. They pull a thick cotton dress over the head of Louis Charles. They tie a linen bonnet under his chin with a fabric ribbon. He wears the physical garments of a girl named Aglaé. King Louis XVI pulls a heavy gray wool coat over his arms. He places a round wig made of brown horsehair on his scalp, wearing the standard uniform of a valet. Marie Antoinette wears a plain black silk dress. She places a wide-brimmed hat on her head. A thick black veil drops down from the brim, covering her face and filtering the light of the candles. The family walks down a narrow wooden staircase in the back of the palace. The wood creaks slightly under their weight. They step out through a side door into the cool night air. A massive Berline coach sits on the cobblestones of the eastern road. Carpenters constructed the wooden body of the carriage to the exact dimensions of a small cottage. Iron workers hammered thick steel plates to create heavy leaf springs. The total structure weighs 2,000 pounds. The interior features thick velvet cushions and wide wooden benches built to provide physical comfort over long distances. 6 large horses stand in heavy leather harnesses. The family climbs up the metal steps and sits on the velvet seats. The driver closes the wooden doors with a loud metallic click. He cracks a leather whip. The heavy wooden wheels turn. The iron rims grind against the stone street. The coach moves east, away from the dense center of Paris. The sun rises on the 21st of June. The horses pull the heavy weight over the dirt road. The iron wheels sink deep into the soft earth, slowing the forward motion. Inside the carriage, the passengers bounce against the velvet cushions. Hour by hour, the shadow of the sun shifts across the dirt. They fall behind the schedule written on their paper maps. Along the eastern route, men wearing blue and red wool cavalry uniforms sit on the leather saddles of their horses. They hold steel swords in their scabbards. They wait at specific crossboards. They look up at the position of the sun in the sky. The appointed hour passes. The men pull the leather reins, turn their horses around, and ride away. The Berlin coach continues moving east, rolling past the empty road junctions where the soldiers previously stood. At 8 o'clock in the evening, the heavy coach rolls into the village of St. Menehould. The wheels stop moving. Men detach the tired horses and lead fresh animals to the wooden poles. A local postmaster named Jean-Baptiste Drouet stands on the dirt road. He holds a piece of coarse paper money, called an assignat, in his right hand. Black ink pressed into the paper forms the exact profile of the king's face. Drouet rubs his thumb over the rough paper. He raises his head. He looks through the glass window of the carriage. He observes the heavy jawline, the prominent nose, and the sloping forehead of the man in the gray coat. The physical shapes of the man match the ink lines on the paper. Drouet climbs onto the back of a brown horse. He kicks the sides of the animal with his leather boots. The horse runs off the main road, its hooves pressing into the soft dirt and fallen pine needles of the surrounding woods. Drouet rides fast between the trunks of the trees, taking a direct path toward the next town of Varennes. The Berline coach rolls into the narrow street of Varennes at 11 o'clock at night. Drouet and a local grocer named Sauce stand in the middle of the road. They hold wooden torches. Yellow fire burns at the ends of the sticks, sending orange sparks up into the dark air. The smell of burning pitch fills the street. They grasp the leather harnesses of the horses. They pull the heavy wooden doors of the coach open. Sauce holds a lit beeswax candle near the face of the man in the gray coat. The yellow light illuminates the sweat on the man's forehead. Sauce speaks words aloud, identifying the king. The family climbs down the metal steps. They walk up a narrow wooden staircase into the upper rooms of the grocer's house. The air inside smells of dried sausages hanging from the rafters, melting wax, and old wood. They sit on straight backed wooden chairs. Hours pass. The sun rises. Men wearing the blue wool coats of the National Guard march into the town. They carry iron muskets with sharp steel bayonets. The family climbs back into the heavy Berline coach. The horses turn around. The wheels roll west, back toward Paris. The journey takes 4 days. The midsummer sun beats down from a cloudless blue sky. The air temperature reaches 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Heat radiates from the wooden roof of the carriage. The wooden wheels kick up thick clouds of white dust from the dry road. The dust settles on the glass windows, coating the glass in a fine white powder. Inside the carriage, the air is completely stagnant. Thick drops of sweat run down the faces of the passengers. The wet moisture soaks into the linen shirts and silk dresses. The thick velvet seats absorb the sweat. Thousands of men and women line the dirt roads. They stand in the direct heat of the sun. They wear coarse wool coats and linen shirts. They keep their wide brimmed felt hats firmly on their heads. They press their lips together. They produce no sound. The carriage rolls past the silent bodies. On the edges of the crowd, men look at the heavy wooden wheels. They open their mouths. They push air past their vocal cords, vibrating the muscles to form the syllables of a specific word. They shape their lips to speak the word republic. They speak the syllables quietly to the men standing next to them. On the final evening of the journey, the carriage stops at a stone inn. Marie Antoinette sits in a small room. The thick plaster walls hold the heat of the day. She dips a white cotton cloth into a small copper basin filled with cool water. She presses the wet cloth against the red skin of her son's face. She wipes the white dust and salt sweat from his cheeks. She lifts her chin. A National Guardsman stands in the open wooden doorway. He wears a blue wool coat stained heavily with road dust. A heavy iron musket rests on his right shoulder. He looks directly at the movements of her hands. The long steel bayonet points straight toward the ceiling, carrying the physical weight of the armed men waiting in the hot, crowded streets of the capital. In the winter months of 1791 and 1792, Marie Antoinette sits at a small wooden desk inside the Tuileries Palace. The air in the room is cold. She dips the sharp tip of a goose feather quill into a heavy iron inkwell. She presses the wet black ink against thick sheets of white paper. She writes letters to her brother, Leopold II, the ruler of Austria. The black ink forms specific words detailing the physical movements of French troops. She writes numbers indicating the count of iron muskets, the volume of black powder, and the exact direction of marching military columns. She writes clear requests for the Austrian and Prussian armies to march their soldiers across the French border. She folds the papers, lights a beeswax candle, and drips hot red wax over the edges of the paper. She presses a metal seal into the warm wax. Men place these sealed papers inside leather pouches and ride horses over the dirt roads toward Vienna. The ink on these pages constitutes the physical evidence of actions defined by lawmakers as treason against the country where she has resided for 22 years. On the 20th of April, 1792, men sit on wooden benches inside the Legislative Assembly Hall in Paris. They speak loud words into the air. They dip quills into ink and sign a parchment document declaring war on the Austrian Empire. Weeks later, French soldiers wearing blue wool coats march toward the eastern borders. They carry heavy iron muskets. The Austrian soldiers fire lead balls into the French lines. The lead pieces pierce the blue wool and the flesh underneath. The French soldiers drop their heavy weapons onto the dirt and walk rapidly in the opposite direction. In July of 1792, the Duke of Brunswick leads the Prussian army onto French soil. He sits inside a canvas tent. He dictates a document. Printers in Paris press wet black ink onto cheap paper, reproducing his exact words. The men and women of Paris hold the paper in their hands. They read the ink on the pages. The printed text states that if any physical harm comes to the royal family, the Prussian army will fire heavy bronze cannons into the stone buildings of Paris until the entire city collapses into rubble. The people read the text. The words on the paper directly link the king sitting inside the Tuileries Palace, with the foreign soldiers marching on the dirt roads outside the city. On the 20th of June, 1792, a large crowd of men and women walk over the cobblestone streets toward the Tuileries. They carry iron axes and long wooden pikes topped with steel points. They reach the heavy oak doors of the palace. They swing the iron axes. The sharp metal cuts deep into the wood. The oak panels splinter and break apart, falling to the floorboards. The crowd walks over the broken wood into the king's apartments. The men hold out a red wool cap, the Liberty bonnet. King Louis XVI takes the cap in his hands and pulls the red wool over his hair. A man hands him a green glass bottle filled with red wine. The king lifts the bottle to his lips and swallows the liquid. In an adjacent room, Marie Antoinette stands behind a heavy wooden table. Her children stand beside her, pressing their bodies against her dress. A line of men and women stands on the other side of the thick wood. The crowd points the sharp steel tips of their pikes toward her chest. They open their mouths and shout loud words at her. The sound of their voices bounces off the plaster walls. She stands completely still on the oak floorboards. She listens to the shouting for several hours. The calendar moves to the 10th of August. A crowd of 20,000 armed Parisians and provincial volunteers marches through the streets. They wrap thick hemp ropes around the carriages of heavy bronze cannons and pull them over the paving stones. The loud rumbling of the wooden wheels echoes against the brick buildings. The royal family walks out of the Tuileries Palace before the crowd arrives. They step onto the crushed white gravel of the gardens and walk toward the building housing the Legislative Assembly. They sit inside a small, square wooden box originally constructed for newspaper reporters. Back at the Tuileries, 600 Swiss guards stand on the polished floorboards. They wear bright red wool coats crossed with white leather belts. They hold their iron muskets. The massive crowd surrounds the palace. The men in the crowd touch burning ropes to the touch holes of the bronze cannons. The black powder ignites. The cannons fire heavy lead balls through the tall glass windows. The shattering glass falls onto the floor. The lead balls strike the Swiss guards. The metal tears through the red wool and shatters the bone and tissue underneath. The guards fall onto the floorboards. 600 bodies lie on the wood. Thick red blood pools on the parquet floorboards and smears across the white marble staircases. The smell of sulfur and copper fills the air. The men in the assembly listen to the loud concussions of the cannons. They vote to suspend the monarchy entirely. 3 days later, on the 13th of August, the royal family climbs into a wooden carriage. The wheels roll over the cobblestones. The carriage stops in the center of Paris outside a medieval fortress called the Temple. Thick walls of rough gray stone rise high into the air. The stone blocks measure 9 feet thick. The guards lead the family through a heavy wooden door bound in thick iron bands. They walk up a narrow stone spiral staircase. The guards lock the iron doors behind them with heavy iron keys. On the 21st of September, 1792, the men in the assembly dip their quills into inkwells. They write new words on parchment. The ink officially abolishes the monarchy. The ink declares the nation of France a republic. Marie Antoinette stands in the small courtyard of the Temple fortress. She wears a plain dark dress. She looks up. The massive gray stone blocks of the tower rise high above her head, blocking the sunlight and the wind. The cold air touches the skin of her face. She blinks her eyes. Her physical surroundings consist of thick stone walls, iron bars, and the blue wool coats of the armed guards. The rough texture of the stone matches the cold air of the courtyard. 22 years earlier, she stood entirely unclothed on the bare pine floorboards of a small wooden pavilion built on an island in the middle of the Rhine River. The cold air of that river island touched her bare skin for one moment, before women draped French silk over her shoulders and handed her a new name. The guards at the temple pushed the heavy iron door open, signaling her to walk back inside the stone tower. The gray stone blocks of the temple tower measure 9 feet thick. Cold air settles permanently in the square rooms. The thick walls absorb the heat radiating from the small wood fires burning in the hearths. The air smells of damp limestone, wet ash, and unwashed wool. Sunlight enters through narrow glass windows. Heavy iron grates cover the glass. The iron bars cast dark, straight shadows across the bare wooden floorboards. Inside these rooms, 5 people sit together. Marie Antoinette wears a plain dark wool dress. Her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, sits beside her. They hold thin steel needles. They push the sharp metal points through pieces of linen cloth, pulling long strands of cotton thread behind the steel. King Louis XVI sits at a wooden table. He traces his index finger over paper maps. He speaks Latin vocabulary words and geographic locations to his 7-year-old son, Louis Charles. 14-year-old Marie Therese holds a leather-bound book and reads the printed text aloud. The sound of her voice fills the small stone space. Of the 4 children born to the Queen, 2 sit in this room. The bodies of the other 2 remain buried in the dirt outside the city. Men wearing heavy leather boots and coarse wool coats pace the stone corridors outside the heavy wooden doors. They carry long iron muskets. They hold pieces of black charcoal in their hands. They scrape the charcoal against the white plaster walls, leaving dark black streaks. The streaks form words describing the bodies of the king and queen in explicit anatomical terms. In September of 1792, Marie Antoinette and her daughter walk in the small walled garden at the base of the tower. They step on the wet grass. The air is cool. Loud voices travel over the high stone wall. The women look up toward a narrow window, opening in the adjacent structure. Two men stand on the other side of the wall. They hold a long wooden pike. A severed human head rests on the sharp steel point of the pike. The hair hangs down in thick strands matted with dark red blood. The facial features belong to the Princesse de Lamballe, the Queen's close companion from the card tables at Versailles. Marie Antoinette looks at the face. The blood drains from her head. Her knees bend. Her body drops heavily onto the wet grass. On the 11th of December, guards turn heavy iron keys in the brass locks. They open the iron banded door of the family's room. They issue verbal orders to the king. Louis XVI stands up from his wooden chair. He puts on his wool coat. He walks out of the room. The iron door closes. The iron tumblers click into place. The guards escort him to a large hall across the city. Men sitting on wooden benches listen to spoken charges and vote on the continuation of his life. Marie Antoinette remains in the tower. She sits on her wooden chair. 39 days pass. On the 20th of January 1793, the heavy door opens again. The king walks back into the room. The guards grant the family exactly 2 hours of physical contact. Marie Antoinette kneels on the hard stone floor next to his chair. She presses her hands against his legs. 7-year-old Louis Charles sits directly on his father's lap. Marie Therese and Elizabeth stand close, wrapping their arms around his shoulders. The air in the room fills with the sound of their crying. The 2 hours end. The guards return. The king walks out the door. The women and the boy remain in the room. The morning of the 21st of January arrives. The sky is pale gray. At 20 minutes past 10 o'clock, soldiers touch burning ropes to the touch holes of heavy bronze cannons in the Place de la Révolution. Black powder ignites. The loud, concussive sounds travel across the stone buildings of Paris. The sound waves hit the thick walls of the temple tower and vibrate the glass in the narrow windows. Marie Antoinette sits in her chair. She hears the explosive noise. The sound coincides with the heavy steel blade dropping onto the neck of Louis XVI. Following the sound of the cannons, Marie Antoinette alters her daily routines. Servants place ceramic plates of boiled meat and roasted vegetables on the wooden table. She leaves the solid food on the plates. She consumes only small amounts of warm broth and cold water. Her physical weight drops rapidly. Her white hair thins. Loose strands fall from her scalp onto the shoulders of her black wool morning dress. When she opens her mouth to speak to her children and her sister-in-law, she replaces her husband's given name with new terms. She vibrates her vocal cords to form the words the late king. Sometimes she simply uses the word him. She sits in a straight-backed wooden chair next to the narrow glass window. The iron grates block portions of the light. She looks out at the gray stone walls of the courtyard. In the center of the room, her 8-year-old son sits on the floorboards. He holds a small wooden top. The toy consists of smooth pine wood carved by his father using a small steel knife during their earlier months in the tower. The boy wraps a thin piece of string around the wooden grooves. He pulls the string quickly. The top spins rapidly on the wooden floorboards. The friction between the wood and the floor generates a low humming sound. The queen watches the spinning wood. Her biological systems begin to fail under the restricted diet and the constant damp cold of the stone rooms. Her gums bleed. She experiences frequent internal hemorrhages, marking the physical progression of a cellular disease in her uterus. She sits in the chair, waiting. waiting as the political committees in the city draft the ink documents requiring her transfer to the damp, subterranean cells of the conciergerie prison. In the spring of 1793, Marie Antoinette sits in a straight backed wooden chair inside the Temple Tower. Her physical body mass is roughly 30% lower than the day she stood inside the Cathedral of Reims. The skin sags against the bone structure of her face. Blood pools in her mouth, leaking continuously from the soft tissue of her gums. She spits the metallic tasting fluid into a white cotton handkerchief. Deep inside her pelvis, cells divide abnormally in her uterus. Constant hemorrhages send thick, dark, red blood soaking into her linen undergarments. She pulls the soiled garments from her body and washes the fabric in a copper basin filled with cold water. At 10 o'clock at night on the 3rd of July, heavy leather boots strike the stone steps outside her door. The iron lock clicks. Commissioners wearing thick wool coats walk into the room. They hold paper documents covered in black ink. They wrap their large hands around the upper arms of the 8-year-old Louis Charles. They pull the boy toward the doorway. The boy drags the leather soles of his shoes across the oak floorboards. The men hand the boy to a cobbler named Antoine Simon. Simon wears a thick leather apron smelling of animal hide, sweat, and shoe wax. The heavy wooden door closes, placing a solid physical barrier of wood and iron between the mother and the son. For the next several days, Marie Antoinette stands facing a thick interior stone wall. A narrow fissure runs through the gray mortar between the limestone blocks. She presses her right eye directly against the crack. Through the small gap in the masonry, she observes the walled dirt garden below. She watches her son walk on the green grass. She remains standing on the wooden floorboards for 4 consecutive hours. The muscles in her legs tremble from the physical exertion. A few days later, masons carry wooden buckets of wet, gray plaster up the spiral stone stairs. They push the wet plaster into the crack with flat steel trowels. The moisture evaporates. The plaster hardens, creating a solid, opaque surface over the gap. At 2 o'clock in the morning on the 1st of August, yellow light from oil lanterns fills the room. Guards wake the former queen from her mattress. They instruct her to put on her black wool morning dress. She presses her hands against the shoulders of her daughter and her sister-in-law. She turns and walks down the spiral stone staircase. She steps out into the dark night. She climbs into a wooden carriage. The iron-rimmed wheels roll over the damp cobblestones. The carriage travels toward the Ile de la Cité, an island situated in the middle of the flowing waters of the Seine River. The carriage stops outside the high stone walls of the conciergerie. River water laps against the stone foundations of the building. The air smells of wet algae, raw sewage, and deep stone decay. Guards walk her through low, arched corridors. Water condenses on the curved stone ceilings, forms heavy drops, and falls into small puddles on the uneven flagstone floor. The damp chill penetrates the black wool of her dress. A clerk sits at a wooden table. He dips a goose feather quill into a glass inkwell. He writes the number 280 next to her name in a heavy leather ledger. The guards push her into a cell measuring exactly 12 feet long and 9 feet wide. The walls consist of rough gray stone covered in patches of green mold. The floor holds smooth red brick tiles. A small canvas cot with a thin straw mattress rests against one wall. A canvas screen, measuring 4 feet high, stands in the corner. Behind this screen sits a ceramic chamber pot. 2 male gendarmes wearing blue wool uniforms sit on wooden chairs inside the cell. They watch her physical movements during the day. They watch her chest rise and fall, while she sleeps on the straw mattress at night. A young maid named Rosalie Lamorliere walks into the cell. She carries a ceramic cup filled with hot meat bouillon. Steam rises from the surface of the brown liquid. She places clean white linen chemises on the edge of the cot. The jailer's wife enters later in the day, carrying a tin plate holding a piece of braised beef and cooked root vegetables. An aging priest, wearing a dark, heavy cassock, walks past the seated guards. He stands very close to the prisoner. He leans forward, placing his mouth near her ear. He vibrates his vocal cords at a low volume, speaking Latin words over the sound of the guards shifting their weight in their wooden chairs. In late August, a royalist officer visits the prison. He drops a cut pink carnation flower onto the red brick floor. A small piece of thin paper sits folded tightly among the overlapping petals. Black ink marks the paper with instructions for a physical extraction from the building. A guard spots the flower. He picks it up with his fingers and unfolds the paper. The guards search the cell. They remove all ink, quills, and blank paper. They move the prisoner to a different cell secured by thicker iron bars and a heavy, double locked iron door. Marie Antoinette sits on the edge of the straw mattress. She holds a small leather bound book containing printed religious prayers. She possesses a small steel pin. She presses the sharp metal point of the pin into the thick paper margins of the book. She scratches the surface of the paper, forming the shapes of letters. She presses the names of her dead family members into the page. She scratches her own name next to theirs. She closes the leather cover. She places the book on the red brick tiles. Outside the heavy iron door, men in the city walk toward the Palais de Justice. They carry large stacks of paper dossiers and prepare to sit on the raised wooden benches of the Revolutionary Tribunal Hall. On the morning of the 14th of October, 1793, the air inside the hall of the Revolutionary Tribunal at the Palais de Justice smells of burning oil lamps, damp stone, and unwashed wool. Tall glass windows line the upper walls of the large room. Gray morning light pushes through layers of dirt on the glass panes. Dust particles float slowly in the visible beams of light. Raised wooden benches occupy the front of the hall. Men wearing dark coats and wide-brimmed hats sit on these benches. These men form the panel of judges. Behind them, a gallery of tiered wooden seating holds hundreds of spectators. The men and women in the gallery press their bodies close together on the hard planks. Heavy wooden doors open at the back of the hall. Guards wearing blue wool coats and carrying iron muskets walk into the room. A 37-year-old woman walks between the guards. Marie Antoinette wears a long dress constructed of black wool. She wears a white cotton cap on her head. The white cap covers a mass of completely white hair. She walks across the oak floorboards. Her leather shoes make flat, rhythmic sounds against the wood. She reaches a single wooden chair, placed in the center of the floor, facing the raised benches of the judges. She bends her knees and sits down on the hard wooden seat. She places her hands on her lap. Two men sit at a small wooden table directly beside her chair. They are her appointed lawyers, Claude Francois Chauveau Lagarde and Guillaume Alexander Tronson. They hold a stack of thick paper dossiers. The black ink on the pages covers hundreds of sheets. Guards handed this large stack of paper to the two men exactly 12 hours prior to this moment. The lawyers turn the pages quickly. Their eyes scan the blocks of ink. The dry paper rustles loudly in the quiet room. The prosecutor, Antoine Quentin Fouquier Tinville, stands up from his desk. He wears a black wool coat. He holds a piece of paper in his hands. He opens his mouth. He pushes air past his vocal cords, projecting his voice across the wide room. He reads the ink words written on the paper. The words describe the physical transfer of gold coins from the national treasury to foreign armies. The words describe the movement of paper letters containing French military locations across the border to the Austrian emperor. Fouquier-Tinville turns to a new sheet of paper. He reads the final charge. The ink on this page describes physical acts of incest between the mother and her 8-year-old son, Louis Charles. At the bottom of the page sits a signature formed by the boy's hand. In the weeks prior, men inside the temple tower repeatedly struck the boy's skin with their hands and wooden sticks. They placed a quill in his fingers and guided his hand over the parchment to form the letters of his name. The ink records physical events constructed entirely by the men holding the wooden sticks in the prison. Fouquier-Tinville finishes reading the words. He lowers the paper. Marie Antoinette remains seated on the wooden chair. She keeps her lips pressed tightly together. She looks straight ahead at the judges. A juror sitting on the wooden benches leans forward. He vibrates his vocal cords, instructing the accused to provide a spoken answer to the final charge. Marie Antoinette places her hands flat on the wooden armrests of her chair. She pushes her physical's weight upward. She straightens her knees and stands on the floorboards. She turns her head away from the judges. She looks directly at the tiered wooden benches filled with women in the gallery. She opens her mouth. She speaks loudly, pushing the sound of her voice up into the high vaulted ceiling. She speaks words regarding the biological mechanics of female bodies and the physical process of giving birth. She states that biology itself rejects the words written on the prosecutor's paper. She issues a direct verbal appeal to the mothers sitting in the room. The women sitting on the wooden planks open their mouths. They shout loud words down toward the judges. The combined sound of their voices fills the large hall, bouncing off the plaster walls and the oak floorboards. The president of the tribunal stands up. He picks up a solid block of wood from his desk. He strikes the wooden block hard against the flat surface of the desk. The sharp cracking sounds cut through the shouting. He yells verbal commands requiring total silence in the room. The women in the gallery close their mouths. The loud noise ceases. Marie Antoinette bends her knees and sits back down on the wooden chair. The clock hands move in slow circles. The trial proceedings run continuously from 8 o'clock in the morning until 11 o'clock at night. The judges stand up and walk out of the room. Guards escort Marie Antoinette down the stone stairs to a cell. At 8 o'clock the next morning, the 15th of October, the guards march her back up the stairs. She sits on the same wooden chair. The men resume speaking. The trial runs continuously for another 20 hours. Over the span of 2 days, she spends 36 hours inside the courtroom. She holds a small tin cup in her hands. She brings the metal rim to her lips and swallows small amounts of cold water. No solid food enters her mouth. The muscles in her calves and thighs tremble from the prolonged periods of standing and sitting on the unpadded wood. She presses her hands flat against the fabric of her black dress to steady the physical shaking in her limbs. The sunlight fades from the high windows. Servants light tall beeswax candles in brass sconces, casting flickering yellow light across the faces of the judges. At 4 o'clock in the morning on the 16th of October, the sky outside the glass windows remains completely black. The president of the tribunal holds a piece of paper. He reads the verdict aloud. The ink dictates a status of guilty on all counts. He reads the physical sentence. The sentence mandates the severance of her head by a heavy steel blade on this exact day. Guards surround the wooden chair. Marie Antoinette stands up. She walks across the oak floorboards and passes through the heavy wooden doors. The guards escort her down the damp stone staircases, deep into the lower levels of the conciergerie prison. She walks into her small, brick floored cell. She takes a piece of flint and a steel striker. She strikes the metal against the stone. A bright spark jumps through the air and lands on the dry cotton wick of a short beeswax candle. The wick catches fire. The yellow flame pushes back the shadows in the stone room. She sits at a small wooden table. She dips the sharp tip of a goose feather quill into an iron inkwell. It is 30 minutes past 4 in the morning. She presses the wet nib against a piece of paper. She writes words addressed to her sister-in-law, Elizabeth. The black ink forms sentences instructing Elizabeth to care for the physical bodies of her two remaining children. She writes words requesting the children to avoid seeking physical retribution against the men operating the tribunals. She reaches the bottom of the page. She lifts the quill and places it on the wooden table. The wet ink dries slowly in the cold, damp air of the cell. She folds the paper. Outside the thick limestone walls, the black sky begins to turn pale gray, revealing the outline of a wooden cart resting on the cobblestones of the prison courtyard. On the morning of the 16th of October, 1793, gray light filters through the small, iron-barred window of cell 280 in the conciergerie prison. The air temperature is low, holding the deep dampness of the nearby Seine River. Marie Antoinette stands on the smooth red brick tiles. She removes the black wool morning dress. She pulls a simple gown made of white piqué cotton over her head. The stiff white fabric falls to her ankles. She pulls white cotton stockings over her calves and feet. She slips her feet into soft leather shoes. She places a white linen bonnet over her head, covering her hair entirely. She speaks quiet words to the maid, asking for clean linen undergarments. A man walks into the damp stone cell. He is the executioner's assistant. He holds a pair of heavy ironed shears. He steps behind the 37-year-old woman. She sits on a wooden chair. He grasps the thick white hair hanging at the back of her neck. He squeezes the metal handles of the shears together. The sharp iron's blades slide against each other, cutting through the thick bundles of hair. The severed white strands fall downward, landing on the red brick floor. The metal blades scrape against the bare skin at the base of her neck. Her neck muscles and her shoulders remain completely still. At 11 o'clock in the morning, the guards instruct her to stand. A man wraps a thick, rough hemp rope around her wrists. He pulls the rope tight, pressing the coarse fibers into her skin. He secures her hands firmly together behind her back. She walks out of the low stone corridors and steps into the open courtyard of the prison. The cold autumn air touches her face. A wooden cart with two large iron-rimmed wheels sits on the cobblestones. The cart consists of flat oak planks forming a floor and low side rails. It contains no roof, no glass windows, and no leather suspension straps. A single wooden bench stretches across the width of the planks. Two horses stand at the front, strapped into thick leather harnesses. Marie Antoinette climbs up the wooden steps. She sits down on the hard wooden bench. Her back remains perfectly straight. The driver snaps a leather whip. The horses pull forward. The heavy iron rims of the wheels strike the uneven cobblestones, creating a loud, continuous grinding noise. The cart moves at a slow walking pace through the narrow streets of Paris. The journey takes 1 hour and 15 minutes. 30,000 men and women stand along the edges of the dirt roads and stone streets. They press their bodies together. The air smells of unwashed wool, damp mud, and horse sweat. Men wearing the blue wool uniforms of the National Guard walk in straight lines on both sides of the wooden cart. They hold long iron muskets. The steel bayonets point upward into the gray sky. The cart rolls forward. High above the street, inside a brick building on the Rue Saint Honoré, the artist Jacques Louis David sits next to an open glass window. He looks down at the wooden cart passing below. He holds a piece of dark lead in his fingers. He drags the lead across a sheet of white paper. The friction leaves thick black lines on the page. The lines form the exact physical shape of her straight spine, the white linen bonnet, and the sharp angle of her jaw. The cart rolls past the tall limestone walls of the Tuileries Palace. She resided inside those exact stone walls for 3 years. She keeps her face pointed straight ahead. Her eyes looked directly at the wooden planks forming the front of the cart. At exactly 15 minutes past 12 in the afternoon, the horses pull the cart into a massive open dirt square. The space is the Place de la Révolution. 23 years earlier, fireworks ignited the black powder sources in this exact location, and the crushing weight of the panicked crowd pressed the life out of 132 people during the wedding celebrations. A tall structure built of heavy oak beams stands in the center of the dirt square. Marie Antoinette stands up from the wooden bench. She steps down from the cart. She walks toward the base of the wooden scaffold. She places her leather shoes on the wooden steps. She lifts her own physical weight up the stairs, moving her legs without the assistance of the guards. As her foot reaches the top wooden platform, her leather shoe comes down, directly on top of the heavy leather boot worn by the executioner, Henri Sanson. She turns her head. She looks at the man wearing the dark wool coat. She opens her mouth and vibrates her vocal cords. She speaks words into the cold air. Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose. Sanson points to a flat, horizontal wooden board. She lies face down against the wood. Men push a heavy wooden block down over the back of her neck, locking her head in place. High above her, a thick rope runs through an iron pulley. The rope holds a heavy block of wood equipped with a wide, angled steel blade. A man releases the rope. The heavy steel blade drops straight down the wooden tracks. The sharp metal edge strikes the back of her neck. The steel cuts through the skin, the muscle tissue, and the cervical vertebrae in a fraction of a second. The severed head falls forward into a leather basket. Henri Sanson leans over. He pushes his fingers into the basket. He grasps the short white hair. He lifts the head high into the air. He turns his body, showing the face to the thousands of people standing in the dirt square. The crowd opens their mouths and shouts loud, sustained sounds of approval. Later in the day, men carry the two pieces of the physical body to the cemetery of the Madeleine. They place them inside a simple box built of raw pine boards. They drive iron nails through the wood to secure the lid. They lower the wooden box into a deep hole dug in the wet earth. They carry canvas sacks filled with white calcium oxide powder, known as quicklime. They pour the white powder directly over the wooden box. The powder rapidly absorbs moisture from the soil. The men use wide iron shovels to push the wet dirt back into the hole, leveling the ground perfectly flat. Back at the Place de la Révolution, the empty wooden cart rolls slowly away over the cobblestones. The thousands of men and women turn their backs and walk out of the square, moving down the narrow city streets. The autumn wind blows across the open expanse of crushed dirt. The moving air catches the edge of a single white cotton bonnet resting on the ground. The fabric rolls slowly over the gray stones, leaving the square empty. Miles away, an 8-year-old boy sits alone on a wooden floor. Inside a small, dark room in the temple tower, breathing the stale air and looking at the thick iron banded door, locking him inside. An iron key turns in the brass lock of a thick wooden door inside the temple tower. The heavy oak door swings open on iron hinges. A single narrow window sits in the thick limestone wall, covered by a grid of heavy iron bars. 8-year-old Louis Charles sits flat on the bare wooden floorboards. The air in the room holds a high moisture content and smells heavily of human waste, damp wool, and stale sweat. Particles of dust float in the faint shafts of gray light passing through the glass. Men wearing thick leather boots and blue wool coats step into the room. They place a ceramic bowl containing cold meat broth and a piece of hard, brown bread on the floorboards. They step back and pull the heavy door shut. The iron tumblers click loudly into place. The boy wears a white cotton shirt and brown wool trousers. He wears these exact garments every day for months. The fabric stiffens with dried dirt, spilled broth, and bodily fluids. He sits in the corner, pressing his back against the cold plaster wall. He keeps his lips pressed tightly together. When the guards open the door and vibrate their vocal cords speak words to him, his own vocal cords remain completely still. A thick layer of gray grime accumulates on the skin of his face, arms, and legs. His hair grows down past his ears, matting into solid, greasy clumps. By the spring of 1795, the boy lies flat on a thin straw mattress in the corner of the room. The Mycobacterium tuberculosis bacteria multiplies rapidly inside the tissues of his lungs and the marrow of his bones. He breathes in short, rapid gasps. His ribs press outward against the skin of his chest. On the 8th of June, 1795, he reaches the age of 10 years. At a specific moment in the afternoon, his chest stops rising. The remaining air empties from his lungs. The boy lies entirely still on the mattress in the small room above the stone courtyard. One floor below, his older sister, Marie Therese, sits on a straight-backed wooden chair. She wears a plain dark wool dress. Her hands rest on her lap. In December of 1795, guards turn the iron keys in the locks of her door. She stands up. She walks out of the room, down the spiral stone stairs, and steps onto the crushed gravel of the courtyard. The cold winter air touches her face. 6 living human bodies belonging to this family walked into the Tuileries Palace in October of 1789. Exactly 1 living human body walks out of the temple tower. She climbs the metal steps into a wooden carriage. The iron-rimmed wheels roll east over the frozen dirt roads. Armed soldiers in blue coats exchange her physical custody for the physical custody of French prisoners held by the Austrian army. She travels across the border to the grand palaces of her Habsburg relatives in Vienna. She walks on polished oak floorboards beneath painted plaster ceilings. For the next 56 years, she lives inside large stone buildings across Europe. She wears black dresses. She sits in chairs and looks at the walls. Her biological functions continue until the year 1851. Her heart stops beating when she reaches the age of 72. In the city of Stockholm, Sweden, Count Axel von Fersen wears a heavy wool military coat, adorned with brass buttons. He lives inside stone houses. He sleeps on his mattresses alone. He dips goose-feather quills into black ink and writes words on paper detailing the specific physical events he witnessed at the French court. In the year 1810, he stands on the cobblestones of a public street. A large crowd of men surrounds him. The men hold heavy wooden clubs and jagged rocks in their hands. They swing the wooden clubs through the air. They throw the rocks. The heavy wood and hard stones strike his head and torso. The physical impact shatters his skull and crushes his internal organs. He falls flat onto the cobblestones. The red blood stops moving through his veins. In Paris, in the year 1815, King Louis Tecfii sits on a velvet cushioned throne. He is the biological brother of Louis XVI. He dips a quill into an inkwell and signs his name to a paper document. The ink on the page instructs laborers to extract the bodies of his brother and sister in law from the ground. Laborers carry heavy iron shovels to the cemetery of the Madeleine. They push the sharp metal blades deep into the wet earth. They dig wide trenches in the soil. They expose thick white layers of calcium oxide powder mixed with the dark brown dirt. The metal edge of a shovel scrapes against a piece of rotting pine wood. The laborers drop their shovels and pull the wet dirt away with their bare hands. They uncover human bones resting in the soil. Amid the bones and the white powder, they find fragments of a black silk garter. The woven silk threads preserved in the earth match the specific garments worn by Marie Antoinette on the morning of her execution. The workers lift the bones from the dirt. They place the skeletal remains of the king and the queen into new wooden boxes lined with thick sheets of gray lead. On the 21st of January, 1815, exactly 22 years after the heavy blade severed the neck of Louis XVI, wooden carriages carry the lead-lined boxes through the streets of Paris. The wheels roll to the Basilica of Saint Denis. Priests wearing stiff silk robes chant Latin words. Men lower the heavy boxes down into the dark, cold stone crypt located beneath the marble floor of the church. Inside the Conciergerie prison, on the Ile de la Cité, masons stack pale limestone blocks and mix wet gray mortar. They build a small chapel directly over the red brick tiles of cell 280. The air inside this new chapel smells constantly of cold stone, damp river water, and burning beeswax candles. During the autumn evenings in Paris, the temperature drops rapidly. The wind blows off the flowing surface of the Seine River. The moving air travels over the stone bridges and pushes through the narrow cobblestone streets. The wind moves at the exact same speed and carries the same smell of damp water and wood smoke as it did in October of 1793. The physical bodies of the king and queen rest in the dark beneath a stone floor. The stone palaces, the wooden carriages, and the iron blades remain stationary objects in the physical world. Printers press new ink onto fresh paper pages. Men and women carry these bound books across oceans and borders. They hand the physical objects to the next generation of readers, moving the printed syllables into the decades following her death. Men stand inside large, brick-walled print shops in the middle of the 19th century. The air in these rooms smells of sulfur, machine oil, and wet paper. The men pick up small blocks of lead type with their ink-stained fingers. Each lead block features a single raised letter. They arrange the lead blocks in straight lines inside heavy iron frames. They spell out the French words for "let them eat cake." They place the lead blocks spelling the name Marie Antoinette directly next to the quote. They pull the heavy iron levers of the printing presses. A flat metal plate pushes the paper down against the inked lead. The wet black ink transfers to the paper. 50 years separate this wet ink from the heavy steel blade in the Place de la Révolution. Men in dusty archives open the surviving paper pamphlets, printed by the actual revolutionaries in 1789. They run their fingers down the columns of text. The ink on those older pages details the physical transfer of gold coins and the movements of foreign armies. Half a century passes before printers set the metal type connecting the Queen's name to the sentence regarding cake. In other archive rooms, Men wearing white cotton gloves turn the pages of the surviving royal ledgers. The heavy leather spines crack as the books open. The black ink forms long columns of numbers. The numbers correspond to the Queen's silk dresses, diamond jewelry, and the wooden structures built in her garden. The ink totals amount to 5 to 7% of the royal household budget. The men turn the heavy paper pages backward to the years covering the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution. The ink numbers in these specific columns occupy massive sections of the pages. The numbers represent the physical transfer of tons of silver to purchase oak warships, heavy bronze cannons, and millions of lead musket balls. Tax officials carrying heavy leather airbags walk across the French countryside. They walk past the large stone chateaux owned by the nobility. They walk past the tall stone cathedrals owned by the clergy. They stop at the mud brick houses of the peasant farmers. They collect copper and silver coins directly from the rough, calloused hands of the farmers. The owners of the large stone estates retain their heavy silver plates and gold coins. The ledgers record the exact physical flow of this metal currency. The calendar pages turn. In the 1930s, a man named Stefan Zweig sits at a wooden desk. He presses the circular metal keys of a mechanical typewriter. The metal arms swing forward and strike an ink-soaked cloth ribbon, leaving black letters on a sheet of white paper. He writes words detailing a young woman moving between the physical spaces of Austria and France. He describes her biological age and the physical constraints of the palace walls. Workers bind these printed pages into books with thick covers. People sit in padded chairs and hold the books in their hands. Decades later, men inside small projection booths feed long strips of celluloid film through the metal gears of mechanical projectors. Bright electric light shines through the moving film. The focused light travels across the dark room and hits a wide white screen. The projected light forms moving images of an actress wearing wide silk dresses and tall powdered hair. People sit in the dark rooms and look at the reflected light. The physical duration of her biological life measures exactly 37 years. She spends the first 14 years walking on the crushed gravel paths of the Hofburg Palace and Schönbrunn. She wears thick Austrian wool. She speaks German words into the cold air. She spends the final 23 years walking on the polished oak floorboards of Versailles and the rough cobblestones of Paris. She wears French silk and heavy cotton corsets. She is the 15th child, born to Empress Maria Theresa. The Empress produces 16 children in total. Today, printing presses across the globe press black ink onto paper, spelling the names of those children. The specific name, Marie Antoinette, appears in the ink exponentially more times than the names of her 15 siblings combined. The listener lies flat on a mattress. The woven cotton sheets rest against the skin. The air moves slowly in and out of the lungs. The chest rises and falls in a steady, slow rhythm. The muscles in the arms and legs relax against the padding of the mattress. The heavy eyelids drop down, covering the eyes. The physical environment in the dark room mimics a specific space located in Vienna in the year 1755. It is the 2nd of November. The night sky is black. Thick glass blocks the cold wind outside the Hofburg Palace. White flakes of snow fall from the heavy clouds. The snow lands silently on the bare branches of the oak trees and the gravel paths of the gardens. Inside the palace, a wet nurse sits in a wooden chair. She vibrates her vocal cords, producing a low, continuous humming sound. In the adjacent room, the infant Antoine sleeps on her back. She wears a white linen shift. The fabric is cut wide and pools around her small legs. Her chest rises and falls with each breath. The air in the room smells of warm milk and melting beeswax. 1,400 miles to the southwest, the stone rubble of Lisbon rests on the wet earth following the massive tectonic shift. Couriers carry paper dispatches over the dirt roads of Spain. The horses require several weeks to travel the physical distance to Vienna. The snow continues to fall in the Austrian night. The heavy brass pendulums of the wooden clocks swing back and forth on the mantels. The wet nurse rocks her wooden chair. The infant breathes in the quiet room.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe to the channel. If you are already asleep, I suppose you can't. Either way, see you in the next video.